around the world. We are really happy for that. So some announcements for you before we start. First of all is that please make all your questions and comments on the Q&A chat box. During this meeting, we are going to try our best to answer all of the questions and probably use some of them during the discussions with the moderators and with the speakers. So feel free to make every question that you feel like. And if you can follow us on the social media, so on Twitter and Instagram, you're going to be able to see what are going to be our next activities. And please follow us on the YouTube channel, because there you have all of the 80 talks, 80 webinars that we have done so far. So you can watch them again. If you miss it, you can watch it and you can share with your team, and we are going to be very happy for that. Now I have a few announcements of this month is going to be amazing. We have a lot of nice things going on. So tomorrow we are going to talk about the pediatric cardiac critical care and the brain, how what we do on the CICU is going to impact the long-term quality of life of our patients. This is a very nice meeting. It's a joint with CENOC and PCICS, and we invite all of you to join. And then we are going to have on 4th of December a webinar in Spanish. If you're a Spanish speaker, please join us. It's going to be very interesting about CCTGA. And then next Monday, we have the second part of this BTT Shunt webinar that we are starting today. So please join us next Monday as well. And then on December the 8th, Gil Vernovsky is going to continue his series of lectures, inviting some friends. This is going to be very nice. My favorite one, I'm sure, is going to be Dr. Mary Cohen talking about women and pediatric cardiology, but we are going to talk about teamwork, training, leadership, and all of that. On 14th of December, we have Dr. Silverman talking in one of his series that he combines morphology and imaging, talking about anomalous pulmonary venous connection. I hope all of you can join. And on the 17th of December, we are going to have an update on fetal cardiology with very nice speakers. And we have every Friday, Dr. Anderson talking about all the morphology of the cardiac defects. I hope you all can join. And just want to remind you that we are going to have the PCICS meeting, and then I will let you, Jill, to talk to you about it now.
Thanks, Grace. Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about our 16th annual international meeting on December 9th through 11th, starting at 10:30 Eastern Standard Time. Of course, we're all disappointed again to not be able to meet in person, but our program committee co-chairs, Nikhil Chinani and Lindsay Justice, have led a team to put together a fantastic agenda. We have sessions on neurodevelopment in collaboration with the Cardiac Anesthesia Society. We also have sessions on challenging CICU dogma, equity and inclusion sessions, and multiple opportunities to still include that networking aspect. So the full agenda and registration details are available. There's a QR code on the previous slide, and we'll also include a registration link in the chat box. Registration is now open.
Jill, excuse me for interrupting. Grace, would you put those slides back up, please, so people can scan the QR code? Thank you.
Thanks, Grace. Registration is open now, and even if you're not available for the meeting, meeting content will be available through the end of January 2021. And I also wanted to point out that registrants from Tier 3 and 4 countries will receive complimentary registration, and non-members of these countries will also receive a 1-year PCICS membership. So it's awesome content. You can see all the details at the link, and please join us.
Amazing. We are going to type on the chat box the link for registration. I'm sure it's going to be very nice. We go there to this meeting every year. This year we are going just to be together online, but it's going to be nice anyway. Okay, so now we are going to start, and I want to really thank again everybody for joining us. And it's my honor to introduce our first moderator, who is the amazing Gil Vernovsky. And so Dr. Vernovsky is a senior consultant in pediatric cardiology and Cardiac Critical Care at Children's National Hospital in Washington, D.C., USA. He is a founding member of the PCICS, the Cardiac Neurodevelopment Outcome Collaborative, the International Society of Pediatric Mechanical Circulatory Support, and the World Society for Pediatric and Congenital Cardiac Surgery. Along with Dr. Jeff Jacobs, he is the co-chair of the 2023 World Congress of Pediatric Cardiology and Cardiac Surgery. And in the past, he played competitive ultimate frisbee, this I didn't know, at the international level, winning 3 gold medals. Mashallah, God bless you. And he's also an avid music lover. He composes and performs music and co-founded the Baby Blue Sound Collective, along with Dr. Tom Carl. Gil?
Thanks, Grace. We asked all the speakers to provide a little bit something personal about themselves, and I really learned a lot about everybody, which is really fun. And we all have to have a hobby and a plan B to keep us energized and doing all the things that we like to do for kids. I want to echo what Jill Zender from PCICS said about this meeting. It's a meeting that has been around since 1996 and has not had the international flavor that I think it can, mainly because of cost and accessibility. So the fact that this is now a complimentary PCICS meeting for Tier 3 and Tier 4 countries, which you'll find on the website, I really encourage people who are joining from those countries to log in complimentary and see the beauty of PCICS. I have the honor of introducing my good friend Shelby Cuddy, who's the Director of Pediatric and Congenital Cardiology at the Johns Hopkins Blalock-Taussig-Thomas Heart Center. I want to be sure I get all of that together. And he's also the chair of Cardiovascular Analytic Intelligence Initiative at Hopkins. He is an expert in cardiovascular imaging with over 260 peer-reviewed publications, and he focuses on the evaluation of myocardial function and treatment outcomes for CHD. And when he's not working, and of course before quarantine, Shelby loved visiting US parks and museums. It's been a crazy year for all of us. And we thought it would be perfectly appropriate with this 2-part webinar focused on the origins and the development of the treatment of tetralogy, starting at Johns Hopkins, where Shelby is the chief. And Shelby, take it away, please. Are you speaking, Shelby? I can't hear you.
I am. Thank you, Gil, first of all, for the introduction. Let me share my screen. I think we are good now, right, Grace? Great.
Perfect.
Great. Thanks, Gil, for the introduction. Hello to everyone around the world. At the outset, I'd like to express my sincere appreciation to the Congenital Heart Academy leadership, Grace, Sasha, and Gil, for organizing this special webinar. In 1944, a profoundly cyanotic child born with tetralogy of Fallot entered an operating room, and for the first time in history, emerged from that operating room alive and pink. The magnitude of this achievement might be hard to fully comprehend today. A surgeon, a cardiologist, and a lab technician had joined forces to produce the first successful palliation for cyanotic congenital heart disease. This operation was a triumph of courage, determination, physiologic insight, and scientific innovation over a seemingly insurmountable clinical problem. Certainly, it's a model for bench-to-bedside clinical investigation, fundamental for medical progress. But it's also a story of how barriers of discrimination are ultimately overcome within academic medicine. Although it took far too long, Vivian Thomas, pictured here with Helen Taussig and Steve Muller, president of Johns Hopkins, was finally recognized for his foundational contributions with a doctorate degree in 1976. Palliation is great when there are no better choices available. But the 1944 pioneers of congenital heart surgery would have wanted us to go much further. We recognize that a systemic to pulmonary artery shunt leaves the patient with at least some ongoing arterial desaturation and continued right ventricular pressure overload. It burdens the left heart by asking it to supply pulmonary arterial blood flow. Later adverse consequences seem inevitable for our shunted patients with tetralogy. To make further progress in the management of tetralogy, we needed many new ideas. We were going to need to understand cardiovascular pathophysiology much better. A better understanding of the genetic component of this condition was going to be helpful. We really needed advances in surgical technique and cardiopulmonary bypass to allow intracardiac procedures. More accurate and powerful diagnostic imaging technologies were required. We needed medical management strategies to limit the late effects of cardiovascular load stresses and ways to organize delivery of lifelong care to adult survivors. All this work is still ongoing, and to push forward, it clearly takes a village. This webinar has brought together a talented and diverse group of specialists to address the current state of all the moving parts that are essential for the best care for tetralogy fellow. I'm especially glad to see some of my long-term personal friends, Tom Call, Z Hijazi, Jeff Jacobs, Charlie Barul, and my dear Hopkins buddy, Darren Klugman, in this excellent panel of speakers. We clearly need to work out a few things if we are going to improve the prospects for these patients. We must characterize the relationship between pulmonary regurgitation, ventricular size, and myocardial function. While it's feasible to replace the pulmonary valve, we still need to know the optimal timing for this and identify those patients who derive benefit from a new valve and distinguish them from those who do not. It would be wonderful to have sensitive and specific biomarkers which could alert us to the risk of adverse events such as arrhythmia, declining ventricular function, changes in exercise capacity and quality of life, and of course, mortality. It's November 30, 2020, but some things never change. The same 1944 model of scientific investigation must remain vigorous in the present day in order to respond to ongoing challenges. Today's investigators will be hampered by small numbers of clinical research subjects with tetralogy. They're simple or not the numbers we get for study of acquired ischemic heart disease in adults, for example. Furthermore, broad heterogeneity in patient anatomy, treatment approaches, and surgical era complicates the use of traditional research methods. Indeed, our current research continues to transform data into insights every day. We may, however, be approaching a point of diminishing return from this classic approach. We now begin to ask, how much will patient outcomes improve from the insights into disease processes we currently get from our clinical research? Shouldn't our goal really be to take all this information and use it to implement appropriate changes in management from which improved outcomes will result? The next evolution will require, in my mind, a fundamentally new approach. Such an approach will involve three paradigm shifts. First, we will need to focus on predicting the lifelong clinical trajectory for patients instead of relying solely on short-term horizons. Second, we need to embrace the complexity of biological systems instead of attempting to deconstruct them and study the individual components in isolation. Complex systems don't necessarily behave like the sum of their parts, and as such, the focus should switch to whole system behavior. Finally, we may benefit from moving beyond the traditional approach of reducing clinical problems to simply a compilation of traditional risk factors. We should start tapping unreduced data sources using newer and more powerful analytic methods. To illustrate this concept, consider a life trajectory project we recently launched in our institution, led by Cedric Manu and I and the Cardiovascular Analytic Intelligence Initiative. We begin with multimodal clinical data input, including imaging, lab diagnostics, and genomics obtained through consortium hospitals. Next, patients consent to share and report outcomes, which are collected through mobile applications. After that, data is processed and integrated using artificial intelligence-based feature extraction algorithms. This allows for application of advanced analytics and machine learning for predictions and trajectory mapping for the patient. The predictive models that are produced can then be tested through clinical trials in associated hospitals. All of this may seem speculative from our perspective in late 2020, but here are some examples of deep learning and computational risk predictive modeling projects currently ongoing at our institution, led by my colleagues, Drs. Ashish Doshi, Natalia Trinova, and Cedric Manu. Today's teams are different from the teams of the past. We all are far more diverse, dispersed, digital, and dynamic, just like this global webinar. However, we still can form a great team. The foundation for it is to have a direction that energizes and engages people, a structure that includes members with a balance of skills, and all this in a supportive environment. So much has changed in our understanding and management of Tetralogy of Fellow, but science is still the name, and collaboration is still the game. Scientific collaboration is even more vital today than it was 75 years ago. Only highly integrated and interactive research teams are going to be successful in developing and sustaining efforts. The critical pieces for success are trust, developing a shared vision, and building the team, along with self-awareness and good communication among the team members. In this way, we can have the optimism that the achievements of the past are only a small step towards a very bright future for our patients with Tetralogy of Fellow. Thank you for your attention. I'll now turn it over to Gil to introduce our keynote speaker.
Shelby, thanks so much for that rapid review and reminding us that this is, to quote my good friend Darren Klugman, the ultimate team sport, what we do. And I'm really pleased to introduce our keynote speaker for this first part of the webinar, our dear friend, Dr. Tom Carl. Tom is a professor of surgery in the Queensland Pediatric Cardiac Research Center, which is at the University of Queensland. And he's a retired professor of surgery from Johns Hopkins and from the University of California, San Francisco. He's the associate editor of the European Journal of Cardiothoracic Surgery and Cardiology in the Young. He is very active in humanitarian pediatric cardiac surgery and has been involved in teaching and operating missions in 21 different countries. Tom is an avid builder and rider of custom road bikes and a lifelong downhill skier of the Sierra Nevada range. He is, along with myself, co-founder of the Baby Blue Sound Collective, which he describes as an eclectic orchestra performing original compositions in multiple genres. And I'm really, really pleased to introduce Tom to give us our keynote lecture, Tetralogy of Flow, What We Have Learned During 75 Years of Surgery and a Global Perspective. Dr. Carl.
Thank you very much, Gil. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay. Well, hello, everybody. And it's a great honor to be invited to deliver the keynote lecture in this symposium. I'd like to speak about Tetralogy of Fallot and what we actually know after 75 years of surgery. Tetralogy of Fallot is, of course, our prototypical lesion, the first cyanotic lesion to be well characterized. Our first palliative and definitive cardiac operations were done for Tetralogy of Fallot. And very importantly, Tetralogy has given us the first cohort of long-term survivors of repaired cyanotic congenital heart disease. And I think we can all agree that the work of the past 7 decades has resulted in an effective alteration of the natural history of the disease. Even though late problems are frequent and at times severe, the perceived health status of most tetralogy patients decades after their operations is usually perceived as normal. If we look in PubMed, in the English language
Tom, do you want to put
alone,
your, Tom, I think you need to put your slides up if you're showing slides.
I am. I thought they were up. I'm so sorry.
No worries.
I have share screen on. Can you see the slides now?
No, we can't.
That's
when
a
you
problem.
when you go to share screen, you should be able to click on your desktop or PowerPoint.
Yeah. How about now?
Here we go. Yep, now just put it into presentation mode and you're all
Yes,
good.
yes, doing it. Okay.
Thank you, Tom.
Yep. I'll just run through these slides. That was the picture of Fallot that I meant to show you. And I was saying that there are nearly 11,000 articles in the English language in PubMed today. And thousands upon thousands of tetralogy operations have been performed worldwide over the past 75 years. And one would really wonder if there's anything more to say about it. On the other hand, despite the long history, the best surgical technique remains a continued subject of debate. And I think it's fair to say that what we learn about the late evolution of tetralogy constantly redefines our primary strategy. Interestingly, we humans are not alone with this disease. It occurs in dogs, cats, horses, ferrets, cattle, lambs, and so on and so forth. And this is a picture of a common ferret with a low hemoglobin saturation. And I think we can also agree that there is a typical cour en sabot pattern on the plain X-ray. So that's a little interesting fact that I came upon when I was preparing for this lecture. Another thing that is possibly new in our understanding of tetralogy is the challenge to the dogma of sporadic mutation as the main cause of tetralogy of Fallot. We now have some genes recently implicated in non-syndromic tetralogy, which makes up about 85% of cases. But I'd like to focus a bit more on the surgical side of this disease. The goals remain the same today as they did in the time of Blaylock and Lillehei. We'd like an operation that's free of mortality and major morbidity, that delivers a functional pulmonary valve, a normal right ventricular pressure, preserved left and right ventricular function, both systolic and diastolic, preserved conduction tissue, and a universal suitability with a good long-term outcome. Let's go back to 1944. The world was a much different place. And like now, there were many astounding events that took place during the span of that year. And I've shown some of them on this slide, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with these events. Well, this is also the year that Blaylock and friends developed the iconic Blalock-Taussig-Thomas shunt. And as Shelby mentioned, this was a gender and racially integrated interdisciplinary team employing a complex novel operation to create a new lesion, which they hoped would palliate a desperately unwell child. And I think as clinicians, we can agree that the physiology after the Blalock-Taussig-Thomas shunt can be difficult to manage even today, especially in certain types of patients. That makes this accomplishment even more remarkable. And this picture will probably appear in the slides of every speaker on the program, but that's okay. You can see Alfred Blaylock operating with Vivian Thomas standing behind him giving advice. And William Longmire was the first assistant, eventually to become a big name in surgery himself. And this operation was made possible in part by the development of some new surgical instruments. This one is for occlusion of the subclavian artery, and it was developed by Vivian Thomas himself. So let's take a look at some of the players on this team. Alfred Blaylock received his MD from Johns Hopkins in 1922. That became the first resident in surgery at Vanderbilt University. His research centered on shock and fluid resuscitation and transfusion, and this work resulted in saving countless lives in battlefield hospitals during World War II. Blaylock eventually returned to Hopkins as surgeon-in-chief and director of the Department of Surgery, and he held this position till his retirement in 1964. And thankfully for our specialty, Blaylock was able to convince the Johns Hopkins administration to bring his lab technician, Vivian Thomas, with him. The racist policies of that era disallowed African Americans on the professional staff, not just at Johns Hopkins, but at many American universities. Well, Vivian Thomas was an amazing character in his own right. He had abandoned his medical study plans after the stock market crash of 1929 in the United States, and he did spend most of his career as Blaylock's lab assistant. As such, he was able to contribute significantly to Blaylock's early research on shock and hypertension as both a technical and intellectual collaborator, again, almost unheard of in the era. And of course, Thomas was the silent partner in the development of the Blalock-Taussig-Thomas Shunt, and he has now been appropriately recognized and honored not only by Johns Hopkins, but by everyone else in our specialty. And has the time come to rename the Blalock-Taussig Shunt? Well, of course it has. And I think that this operation is now referred to as the BTT Shunt in almost every venue. In the lower right-hand frame is a photograph of the actual first survivor of the Blalock-Taussig-Thomas Shunt. This is Anna, who was a lab animal. And after she survived the operation, she was freed from her duties and further research and kept as the pet of Vivian Thomas in the lab. And she was occasionally brought out to visit survivors of the Blalock-Taussig-Thomas Shunt. You've already seen some frames from the film advertised on the left. There are actually two film accounts of the relationship between Blaylock, Vivian Thomas, and Helen Taussig, and they're both very good, highly entertaining, and to the best of my knowledge, quite factual as well. This leaves Helen Brooke Taussig, who is, of course, the mother of pediatric cardiology, another amazing character from Johns Hopkins. She graduated in 1927, remained there for her pediatric career, and she very early on recognized the pathophysiology of Tetralogy of Fallot and the important role of ductal closure. Supposedly in 1943, she posed the question to Blaylock, if you could put the carotid artery into the descending aorta for a coarctation repair, couldn't you put the subclavian artery into the pulmonary artery? And of course, the rest literally is history. And Taussig's landmark Congenital Malformations of the Heart was published in 1947. The BTT shunt provided proof of concept, but it had many important consequences. It was known now for the first time that hemoglobin saturation and polycythemia could actually be improved just by increasing pulmonary blood flow. It was learned that the subclavian artery could be sacrificed without extremity loss or brain damage, which actually was not known prior to this procedure. There was proof that hemostasis was possible in complex vascular procedures, even in cyanotic patients, that safe anesthesia was a possibility in the same type of patients, that the history, physical, chest x-ray, and fluoroscopic exam could be effective diagnostic tools. It also marked the ascent of pediatric cardiology as a specialty and the inclusion of translational research as an important concept in that specialty. And as Shelby also mentioned, this was possibly the beginning of the resolution of some of the injustices that permeated academic medicine based on both gender and race. There are some other players in the BTT story whose names may not be as familiar. Olive Louise Berger became the chief nurse anesthetist at Johns Hopkins in 1931. And during her 38 years there, she witnessed the transition from nurse technicians as anesthesiologists to physicians and the creation of another new specialty. Berger and her fellow nurses continued to perform much of the day-to-day work of hospital anesthesia, and the BTT shunt operation really illustrates this continuity amidst change. And finally, Richard Bing, who set up the Hopkins Laboratory for the physiologic and diagnostic study of congenital heart disease. Incredibly, by 1947, over 100 tetralogy patients had been catheterized. This would be an accomplishment even today. Bing, Blaylock, and Taussig, as most of you know, identified and published on at least 20 different types of congenital heart defects, including the Taussig-Bing anomaly. What you may not know is that Richard Bing was also a true Renaissance man, an author of 500 peer-reviewed scientific articles, composer of more than 300 pieces of classical music, and author of 5 books of fiction. Well, let's jump ahead 10 years and look at the world as it was in 1954. Again, an astounding set of accomplishments and events occurred that year in various fields of endeavor. And one of the greatest of these achievements involved the first open heart surgical procedures. There were several players in this story, but the one who is really best known is C. Walton Lillehei, working at the time at the University of Minnesota. And he performed our first successful open heart procedures using cross circulation, generally, but not always, between parent and child. These operations were performed in the face of strong peer opposition, including pushback from his chief of medicine. But Lillehei persisted, and again, the rest is history. He stopped operating at the age of 55 years for health-related reasons. And interestingly, this is the current median age for pediatric cardiac surgeons working in the United States. Lillehei was a pioneer in so many areas of pediatric cardiac surgery. We have to ask why there is no eponymous operation in the Lillehei legacy. And finally, at least 820 cardiothoracic surgeons from 36 countries at last count can trace their lineage to C. Walton Lillehei. And of course, I include myself in that group. This is a photograph taken during the first operation with cross circulation. And you can see that there's another all-star team here, consisting not just of Lillehei, but Richard Varco, Morley Cohen, Herbert Warden, Vincent Gott, Norman Shumway, and last but not least, the patient's father, who served as the donor pump for this operation. The child was 13 months old, had an unrestricted ventricular septal defect, may not have been the best surgical candidate, but was going nowhere clinically. Operation was done without any aortic clamping, 19 minutes of cross circulation. The pump sucker had not yet been developed, so there was no salvage of blood possible during this operation. The patient survived for 10 days, succumbing to pneumonia, but Lillehei, in very short order, achieved much better success with subsequent patients. Between 1954 and 1955, when this technique was abandoned in favor of an assembled mechanical pump and oxygenator, Lillehei operated on 45 children using cross circulation. This cohort included the first repairs for ventricular septal defect, tetralogy of Fallot, and atrioventricular septal defect. And I can tell you from looking through the archives that these were not always straightforward cases. 62% of the patients were discharged alive from the hospital, and 49% were alive and well 30 years later. And the actuarial curve is shown on the left. Well, let's talk about surgery for tetralogy of Fallot today. The technique employed by Lillehei involved a transventricular approach to both the right ventricular outflow tract obstruction and closure of the VSD, with or without a patch. This transventricular repair has been nominated as the cause of many of the late problems that we see in Tetralogy of Fallot survivors. Yet somehow it never seems to go out of style. If you look at the STS and EXA databases, you can see that even in recent times, the majority of teams prefer a transventricular approach for repair of Tetralogy of Fallot. And one would have to wonder if this is the true Lillehei legacy. As a forward-thinking surgeon, it's hard for us to accept that Lillehei would not have refined this operation in such a way that the function of the pulmonary valve and the right ventricular myocardium could be better preserved. This is an extremely important paper that I don't think has had its due recognition, written by Alessandra Frigiola, published from Great Ormond Street in 2013, looking at the phenotypic characteristics of late survivors of Tetralogy of Fallot repair who are free from pulmonary valve replacement. And using a number of imaging and other physiologic techniques, the team determined that mild right ventricular outflow tract obstruction is a good thing, and as has been suspected clinically for decades, could be protective in some way from the long-term effects of pulmonary insufficiency. And I think this type of information is well worth our notice, since this is probably one of the main problems seen today in adult congenital heart disease clinics, and is certainly the most common reoperation in that specialty. The other point that is a subject of continuous debate is the best timing for elective surgery in Tetralogy of Fallot. The fact is that most Tetralogy patients do not require neonatal surgical treatment based on cyanosis alone. Ductal dependency is one cause, but this is probably best treated with stents today in the majority of cases. So the important surgical argument, therefore, is not primary repair versus a palliative shunt, but rather non-neonatal versus neonatal elective primary repair. And we have gone back and forth on this for decades, and I've worked in institutions that favored neonatal repair for all patients. I've worked in other institutions that have favored a more conservative approach, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So there was a very good paper that was published from one of the sponsoring institutions for this symposium, dealing with a mathematical model for the best timing of elective infant tetralogy repair. And it was calculated based on the probability of reintervention at 2.3 years, that 55 days of age was the optimal time. It's interesting because I think that this is a time frame that's extremely well accepted and practiced by most large centers in the United States today. On the other hand, when we talk about Tetralogy of Fallot repair in disadvantaged or developing countries, the equation will change considerably, mostly because we don't even see these patients, and the ones who are ductal dependent probably don't survive to have later treatment. Well, for some decades, we've favored the transatrial transpulmonary repair of Tetralogy of Fallot performed in non-neonates. With this strategy, the right ventricular incision is limited to about 20 millimeters, and a transannular patch is applied as needed based on a Z-score less than 0 after complete mobilization of the pulmonary valve leaflets. This is done in an anatomic fashion, and if a transannular patch is needed, we almost universally employ pulmonary valve leaflet augmentation by the Sung technique to preserve pulmonary valve function. Why do we think a transannular transpulmonary approach is good? Well, certainly the functional contribution of the infundibulum to the right ventricular stroke volume is minor compared to that of the body of the right ventricle. And it's been known for years that this approach results in less right ventricular dilation and better preservation of contractility at late follow-up. And looking at some of our patients from the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne, there was an 87% freedom from pulmonary valve replacement and clinically significant right ventricular dilation at 25 years follow-up for patients operated according to the strategy that I just outlined. For the past 2 decades, we have added pulmonary valve leaflet enlargement in cases that do need a transannular patch to achieve an adequate right ventricular outflow tract. This whole operation is possible at any age. It's easier and more reliable in non-neonates. It can be done at full flow cardiopulmonary bypass with little or no hypothermia, and certainly there shouldn't be a need for any circulatory arrest. Importantly, this technique allows us to close all atrial communications to prevent postoperative cyanosis, which can be somewhat unpredictable. And the goal of the operation, which we can usually realize, is to eliminate early pulmonary insufficiency and right ventricular outflow tract obstruction following the operation. Now, I wish I could say that these improvements were sustained in the long term, but that unfortunately is not the case. And I'll say a word about that in a moment. This is what the trans-tricuspid resection of the parietal extension of the infundibular septum looks like. And on the right-hand side, trans-tricuspid valve closure of the malalignment VSD, which is virtually always possible in tetralogy of Fallot. In fact, there are much more difficult VSDs that we routinely close through the tricuspid valve. And this aperture actually gives you a much bigger operative field for VSD exposure than would a small right ventriculotomy. So if the Z-score following mobilization of the leaflets is inadequate, then we divide the anterior pulmonary leaflet through its midpoint. We might vary the location of this incision based on particular anatomic characteristics. And then a 2-patch repair is employed. The first patch is sutured to the cut pulmonary valve leaflet edges and the endocardium of the right ventricular outflow tract, which has the effect of augmenting the anterior leaflet. And we calibrate the orifice to a Z-score of +2. This effectively moves the annulus inferiorly, and some of the hinge mechanism function is probably preserved. The second patch is then sutured to the pulmonary artery incision and to the right ventricular outflow tract epicardial edges. And in doing this, we create a bi- or tri-leaflet pulmonary valve with an anterior sinus of Valsalva. This is not a monocusp repair, as has been proposed by many teams in the past, but an enlargement and preservation of the existing pulmonary valve leaflets, which we expect will coapt following repair. And importantly, the entire transannular patch with this technique is effectively moved to a supraventricular position. Our initial experience was reported when I was working in San Francisco, 43 patients, and we were able to demonstrate an improvement in the immediate postoperative course in the intensive care unit compared to contemporary and historical controls. And we noted that there was a freedom from moderate or worse pulmonary insufficiency of about 75% at 5-year follow-up, with very rare occurrence of any residual right ventricular outflow tract obstruction. And in these echo frames, you can actually see the coaptation of the augmented anterior leaflet and the native posterior leaflet. More recently, and this paper is currently in press in JTCVS, we've reported the outcome for 131 cases operated in Brisbane and Liverpool between 2007 and 2019. The median follow-up was about 74 months. And at 5 years, the freedom from severe pulmonary insufficiency was 78%, similar to what was reported in the previous study. And patients who had their leaflet augmentation done with 0.1 millimeter PTFE as opposed to glutaraldehyde treated autologous pericardium were at lower risk for progression of pulmonary regurgitation. This is what freedom from reintervention for pulmonary stenosis looks like. Also, at least as good as repairs that we have used in the past. So, in summary, the Sung transannular transpulmonary technique is a good choice for infant tetralogy repair when the pulmonary valve leaflets cannot be spared due to the restrictive nature of the right ventricular outflow tract. This operation does provide reliable early control of pulmonary insufficiency and right ventricular outflow tract obstruction, and as such is probably a useful tool for improving the early postoperative course. The long-term outcome may be better than for other transannular patch strategies, but it remains imperfect, as I said earlier. It is certainly competitive with other valve sparing strategies. The technique is straightforward and suitable for most cases, and it's quite reproducible and easy to learn and teach. Well, there would be a lot to say about repaired tetralogy of Fallot as an entity, and it really is like a new disease with its own prevalence, physiology, and unnatural history. And I think one could spend an hour talking about this problem. I won't do that, but I would just like to introduce you to a good friend of mine, Mike Edinburgh, who is reporting to us today, a former BTT shunt patient back for his 75-year follow-up appointment. And I'd like to welcome you, Mike. Mike had his operation for tetralogy of Fallot on the 2nd of October, 1945, age 2 years and 7 months. And this operation was performed by Alfred Blaylock himself. He was logged into the Hopkins Clinic by his cardiologist, Helen Taussig, as blue baby number 44. And that's a picture of Mike on the left a few weeks after surgery, and on the right as he looks today. My association with Mike is based on my work with Gift of Life International in the Philippines, where Mike has lived for some years. Here are some letters regarding Mike's follow-up, one signed by Helen Taussig, one signed by Alfred Blaylock. These are important historical documents which now reside in the Johns Hopkins archives. And here's Mike with some members of the Gift of Life International team and a patient and his father at the Vicente Soto Hospital in Cebu City. So I'm going to let Mike talk for himself and tell you a bit about his life. I have a few questions that I'll pose. And then Gil, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that we'll be open to questions for Mike, who also may have a few questions for all of us. So thank you for your attention during my portion of the talk. And Gil, can you bring Mike online, please?
Yeah, I think if you stop sharing your slides, then we'll have the, and if the people in the audience go to the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom screen, and where it says view with a bunch of little boxes, if you click speaker, you will get Mike when he is speaking and Tom when he is speaking. And Tom, thank you very much for that. And Mike, I have one question before you start. I know you're a jazz aficionado. Who is your favorite keyboard player?
Favorite what?
Your favorite keyboard player?
Oh, well, Thelonious Monk, for one.
Good answer.
Obviously, excellent neuroprotection during both operations. And I'll turn this back over to Tom and Mike to share their experience with us. And Mike, thank you for joining from the Philippines.
My honor. Thank you.
All right, Mike. Yes, it's a great honor to have you with us. And I must say you're looking quite well, as you always seem to. I'd like to ask you a few questions, and then you can make any sorts of comments that you want. You may have some questions for all of us. What do you remember about your childhood in terms of any disability or physical limitations after your Blalock-Taussig-Thomas shunt operation performed at Johns Hopkins?
I remember having to go up a hill to like second and third grade, and it was a pretty significant incline, but my sister was having no trouble with it. But I would have to stop once or twice along the way and catch my breath. And then I also recall my father bought a powered lawnmower, and that was my job to mow the lawn, which was fine. Well, it wasn't a push, it was all gasoline powered, you know. But by the time I finished the yard, I had a raw throat from breathing so hard. So I was constantly winded when in situations like that. Another painful memory, which is why I'm here, is cold weather. I really suffered in the cold weather. So, and Iowa is noted for pretty severe winters, and so is the Northeast, of course. So when I retired and chance to move here, I jumped at it, and I've been walking around in shorts and sandals ever since, for the most part.
All right. So, Mike, you lived for a long time, some 17 or 18 years, just on the shunt palliation. In fact, when you had your shunt operation, the complete repair hadn't really been accomplished. That was almost 10 years after you were treated. So you didn't wind up having a tetralogy repair until you were about 20 or 21 years of age. Is that correct?
Yes, it was my 21st birthday present. I spent my 21st birthday in a hospital.
Tell us a little bit about your memories of that ordeal.
I had been involved in an automobile accident where I got a bad cut inside my mouth from my teeth due to head-on collision, and I got SBE. So I was out of school the whole third quarter of my senior year in high school, and I was take penicillin, be okay. A few days later, fever's back, off and on, off and on. So finally, one night, it just really had my parents fearful that I wasn't going to make it. So they called Dr. Ruth Whittemore at Yale, who had worked with Dr. Helen Taussig for many years. And he said, bring him now. I just then my fever broke. So they brought me in the morning. And I was on 12 units of penicillin, for about a couple of weeks. And that killed the bacteria. But then that accident really saved my life, because I didn't realize how sick I was until they had a chance to evaluate me and find out that the tetralogy wasn't, the PTT shunt wasn't capable of handling somebody in their 20s.
And how long after your treatment for endocarditis did you wait for your complete repair?
It was about 4 or 5 months, as I recall.
4 or 5 months. And that was performed at Yale University by Dr. Horace Stansel, another big name in cardiac surgery.
Yes.
How did you feel after the operation? Did you notice a difference?
Oh, night and day. Talk about being reborn. I was reborn.
How long did it take you to recover from that operation, till you felt 100% again?
I would like to say, when I came home after, I think I was there 3 weeks of recovery. And then when I came home, I went up the stairs. I wasn't supposed to go upstairs, but I knew my limitations. And I had no problem. And I mean, pretty much right from the get-go, as soon as I got home, I never looked back, and I was fine. So I don't remember any issues after that. I remember before that, all my friends were always having to wait for me to catch up to them because I was huffing and puffing. And after the operation, the reverse was the case. I was waiting for them. So
okay,
I was much energized.
Now, this is a question that you and I have probably discussed in the past in Cebu, but at what point did it occur to you that your story might be extraordinary and that there weren't a lot of people like you walking around with relatively early in the piece repair of a complex congenital heart problem? Was this on your radar screen at the time?
I never really thought too much about it, but I think the thing that caught my attention was something the Lord made. When that movie came out, I thought, oh, I know all about that. And
I guess you did.
That's when I became a little aware that maybe there's some significance there.
Do you have any significant memories of your medical team, of Helen Taussig or Alfred Blaylock?
Not, and I didn't ask my parents, but I did follow up with Helen Taussig, and Helen Taussig used to thump my chest with her fingers to get an idea of the size of my heart. This is a woman who was hard of hearing. I don't know if you, I'm sure most of you.
We know about that. Yes. Amazing story.
My mother, I remember, treated her like royalty whenever I was brought there to be evaluated. She was extraordinary lady.
So Helen Taussig was the keynote speaker at the Second World Congress of Pediatric Cardiology, which was held in New York City in the 80s. And in her later years, she became very interested in bird hearts. And her lecture was about avian heart morphology and the similarity between bird hearts and the hearts of children with congenital heart disease. I don't know if I ever mentioned that to you, but like the others involved, she had a lot of far-reaching interests, even outside of pediatric cardiology per se. So, you know, Mike, you have had a very successful life, and from what I know of you, it seems like a very happy life as well. And I think that you've demonstrated that that you've survived all of this with your cognitive function well intact. You started your own computer business, which was successful, and you're you know, active today with the specialty. How do you feel about that? I mean, would you say that your health and stamina and so on is the same, better or worse than other people in your era at this age?
I mean, in my head, I'm still in my 20s, you know, I still weigh the same as I did. I still walk the same as I did. I'm still, everything is, except my forehead has gotten a lot higher, a lot larger, you know. That's the only difference I can put my head around. So I'm doing great, you know. I did have a back injury, so I had that operated on, and I did lose a kidney in 2001. But other than that, you know, putting me to sleep for a surgery is nothing, doesn't faze me in the least.
Yeah, I can see from your story that you're not a stranger to adversity, but somehow you always prevail. You know, people like you are the reason that are one of the big reasons that we all do what we do. And I was just wondering if there's anything specific that you'd like to say to the pediatric cardiac community. Yeah, you know, even if it's a complaint, Mike, it's okay.
No, I just am really in such admiration for what you all do, because it isn't, I can't understand what it could be other than just love for helping children with the problem. I mean, that's the only thing I can get my head around. Why else would you go into a field like that? That has its certainly its ups and downs, more ups I know than downs, but there are times when it's not great, and those you have to set those with the others. But the rewards are hard to.
Yeah, well said, and I think most of us would agree with that. I think this would be a good point to open it up to questions, if that's okay with you, Gil.
Yeah, it is, Tom. The way the webinars are set up is that we don't have the ability to like have an audience member approach a microphone.
Right.
So what I would encourage people to do on the bottom of your Zoom screen, not the chat function. It's important you don't use the chat function. Use the Q&A box, and you can ask questions to Mike. And Mike, I suspect there may be one or two. You may be busy for the rest of the webinar, but you'll have a chance when you respond, everybody can see your responses. And it's just been truly amazing to have you as part of this, to hear your story. Hope and triumph seem too small of words to put into, for me to put into my I just can't put it into words, as you can tell. I mean, it's just been absolutely amazing to hear you. I did want you to know, Mike, that just as a token of our appreciation, we have made you a Congenital Heart Academy shirt.
Wow.
And it's got the number 44 on the back.
Really? No kidding.
Yeah, and you'll be receiving that in the mail. We'll be getting your address. And it seems like such a small token of our appreciation, but it's just been terrific to have you. You're now officially a faculty member and a well-loved member of the Congenital Heart Academy.
I can't wait to wear that to a Rotary meeting, because the Rotary is life. You know?
That's great. And we're going to have to talk music at some point, but I'm going to close this portion of the sentence. Is there anything else you'd like to tell everyone out here? Or Tom, do you have any closing remarks?
Maybe, Mike, you would like to just say a word or two about your involvement with Gift of Life and the humanitarian pediatric cardiac surgery program.
Good idea. I joined a Rotary Club when I moved here, because I really liked helping people. And then I moved to Cebu and joined another club, which I had no idea was a Gift of Life club. And once I found out, then I couldn't believe the fit. So we've operated on over, thanks to people like Tom and Rodrigo, over 400 people have been saved in Cebu because of their kindness and their dedication. So we have what they call a VTT, which is a vocational training team. And the people like Tom come in and teach the local people. Even biomedical engineers come in and teach the engineers here how to do what they have to do. So anesthesiologists and perfusionists and everybody, the whole team, 20 plus people come here before COVID, 3 or 4 times a year just to do that. So that's a real act of love. One other thing I want to mention too, it's not that significant, but one time I had changed schools from a very small school to a school with 3,000 students. And I was walking down the hall one time, and I'm 126 pounds. I've always been 126 pounds since I can remember, since high school. And some jock, some bully said to me, "Hey, Skinny, your ribs are showing." So I kept walking for a few steps, and I thought, I'm not gonna let him get away with that. So I went back to him and I said, "See these fingers? See that blue?" "No." "Well, that's a heart condition. Just thank God you don't have it." I turned around and walked away. His friends were really laughing it up until I said that, and then dead silence. So hopefully he's not a bully anymore, you know. Hopefully he learned a lesson from that. So this has its pluses too, you know.
Mike, that's just fantastic. There's a couple of questions that are popping up in the Q&A. There is one question from Dr. Salam to all the surgeons in the panel, if you'd like to answer that. And I'm going to shift right now quickly to the audience participation part here. You should be able to now see, if you open up on your, I don't know if it says Mo on yours or not, but if you open up your slides, you should be able to join along with answering some of the poll questions. You could do this on your mobile device. You could do this on a second browser window if you're using a laptop. And I would encourage everyone to jump in on this. It's really a lot of fun. Just want to start out with just a few demographics, if you don't mind. If you could just initially tell us where you're from. Not too surprising, the early ones are in from North America. Every time we do this slide, I absolutely love what we're doing with the Congenital Heart Academy, not limiting all this teaching to the developed countries, but getting many, many participants from all over. We've reached over 125 individual countries at this point. And if you log on a little bit late, I think we have 330 people watching, and we only have about 80 currently taking the poll. So again, I would encourage you, because this will help Mike and others as we learn. And I want to know who's here from Antarctica, so we'll get that in just a little bit. All right, I'm going to move to the next question. You have to hit next question on your phone or whatever it might be that says, what do you do for your daily practice if you are in the medical field? I think we have a number of patients and families on specifically to hear Mike. And this is great, a very wide swath of individuals who take care of kids with heart disease. And as Shelby, you were saying at the beginning, this is a collaborative effort, and you can see that from the distribution, I think, of this particular slide. And we'll share these on the YouTube channel recording at the end. How'd you learn about this webinar? This will be very quick. Hit the next slide, please. There's now about 1/3 of the audience logged in. In prior webinars, we have been really surprised at our lack of reach on social media. So maybe if you could, there's some things we can talk about at the end that might be a way to improve our reach on social media. But most of it is still by email. Interesting. All right, I'm going to move to the next one, but if you get on late, these answers will still be recorded. Very quickly, my age bracket is, and we typically have a skewed curve to the right with the majority in yellow to green, which is pretty typical for what we have here today. All right, I'm going to move to the next one before we get to some of the fun questions. I have to tell you, having done a number of lectures, it's really hard looking at the Zoom screen, not being able to gauge what the audience is like. And I think that this is going to help the rest of the speakers as we move forward. Okay, it's typically about that. As you know, we're partnering with the Pediatric Cardiac Intensive Care Society. The major web address is up there. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, the PCICS meeting is taking place from international meeting from the 9th to the 11th. The agenda is just one of the best agendas I've seen. And now that it's being offered free of charge to tier 3 and tier 4 countries, which you can see on the website, I'd really welcome everyone to join. I don't know if Jill is still on. Maybe if she is, she can say if, no, never mind. I do know. If you can't join because of the difficulty of transmission across time zones, you're able to look at these lectures at a later date. So I do encourage people to take a look. Okay, so this is a word cloud. If you could list, there we go. If you could list 3 things you learned, 3 new things you learned from Dr. Carl's presentation. Not sure why this isn't coming through. There we go. RVOTO is good. I always love this part because the things that come across, especially the ones that are the ones there at the very beginning and stay that way. So half of you have plugged in. Let's do a few more. Tom, I don't know if you remember this, but our colleague, Dr. Spray, once said that once you start giving the history talks, you have 1 foot in the grave.
That's right.
So sorry, man. I know that's not true with you. You are incredibly spry and a bike rider and skier and all that sort of stuff. So
I started doing history of tetralogy in 1986, just for your edification.
Thanks, man.
So rumors of my demise are premature.
Was that W.C. Fields?
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought so. All right, I'm going to move to the next question, and I'm particularly interested here. Please enter 3 words that describe your thoughts and feelings after hearing Mike and telling his story, telling his journey. And we still have, good, we have about 100, about a third of the audience is still on. Mike, I hope you didn't mind me doing this, but it was, I have no words for how important that was for all of us to hear. So thank you.
It was just very easy for me, so, and real honor. So very happy to do that.
Excellent. And I'll send you a copy of this so that you can have that next to your letters from Taussig and Blaylock.
Oh, nice. Oh, nice. And the shirt.
And the shirt, absolutely. Don't forget the shirt.
Don't forget the shirt.
Grace, I think we have to open up a store. We need like a CHA store.
Merch table.
Bling. We need CHA bling.
I can't do that.
Oh, good. This is fantastic. All right, we'll keep collecting those as we get into some of the parts that we're going to hear a little bit about in the next. I'm going to propose a case to the audience. You have a 3-week-old baby who weighs 3.6 kilos, is moderately hypoxemic at baseline with oxygen saturations at 80%, frequently falling below 70%. The pulmonary valve is 4 millimeters with dynamic sub-PS as well, and there's a 2 millimeter PDA. What would your recommendation be at your center, or if you are the surgeon, what operation would you do, or nothing? We got about a third of our people now entering in. I know where Dr. Poirier is coming down on this one, which you'll hear about in the next session. Dr. Hijazi and Dr. Bonhoeffer, you can't vote 25 times for stenting the PDA. You're only supposed to vote once.
Well, that's allowed in the United States, actually.
I knew you were going to come in with that, Tom. We're going to stay away from politics. All right, we've got 70 people have answered. So it looks like roughly equal balances between shunt palliation, complete repair, and stenting the PDA. Non-surgical treatment or non-interventional treatment was only by 5 of currently 75 people. Okay. At my institution, the typical age to repair a baby with tetralogy who's asymptomatic is, and you have your choices between 1 to 3 months, 4 to 6 months, 7 to 12 months. I didn't put 55 days in here, Tom. I didn't realize that my colleagues actually published on that. I know we published a paper out of CHOP where, again, in a developed country, we landed on about 3 months. And in much of the published literature is in the developed world is somewhere in infancy.
Right.
It's interesting in this rather diverse group of attendees that we're getting this answer. Now let's get back. This is an asymptomatic baby. And of course, I know, Tom, you'll correct me, babies don't have symptoms, but they have signs. But in a baby that doesn't have a clinical need to operate. And now we're going to move to the baby that does. Actually, we're going to go to this. At my institution, during repair of TOF in infants, if you do infant repair, an atrial level shunt is intentionally left open, always and never, the 2 worst words in medicine, and some of the time. Not a scientific poll, but it's good to get a feel for what the audience is doing. At my institution, if you do neonatal repair, an atrial level shunt is intentionally left open, never, always, some of the time, I don't know. So there's a tendency, it looks like, leaving a right to left shunt is related to younger age, at least today. Okay, we're fortunate to have Ogo Sokombi with us today. So she wanted to ask a couple of questions here. There's one right answer here. What's the major impediment to definitive care of the Nigerian child with tetralogy of Fallot? What do you think? You'll learn about this shortly. Wait another 30 or 40 seconds here. And we'll learn this shortly, but the correct answer is cost. I had to make up the other 5. So I fooled whatever that different number is there, 36 of you. Okay, next. What's the typical age for TOF in Nigeria? Ogo, are you surprised by any of these answers so far, or is this what you thought the audience would say?
Yes, I think so. I think this is what I thought the audience would say.
Okay. I'm really looking forward to learning this. Again, according to Ogo, the correct answer is 1 to 2 years, although many are operated on at an older age. Okay. In the USA, there's about 1,600 babies born annually with TOF. How many are born with TOF annually in India? And we have both Parvati and Krishna Iyer on, who are going to be telling us about their experience in India. You're all pretty close. But as of right now, only 17 of you had the correct answer, which is between 14,000 and 15,000 born each year with tetralogy in India. True, false question. There are more elephants in India than children with TOF. Parvati, I thought this was a fantastic question.
It should be truncus.
Oh, that's horrible.
That's typically Tom.
That is classic Tom. Parvati, do you want to make a comment about this? I don't know if you're on mute or not.
There are 14,000 children born with tetralogy each year. So in 2 years, there are 28,000. And unfortunately, so many elephants have been killed. There are totally only 27,000 elephants left in India.
Oh, it's so sad.
That's a tragedy.
Yeah, it sure is. In busy units in India, so that's described as 500 cases per year, the average number of children, if you're not speaking, please hit mute. The average number of children with TOF prepared every week is, there are some really large units in India. So you can picture this type of patient flow in your own unit, wherever you work, where you might have one baby with tetralogy every single day, 52 weeks a year. The correct answer was 3 to 4. For some reason that didn't come up, but I'm sure we'll be hearing that in the talk. Last couple of questions. Could you list 3 topics you'd like to see in future webinars, please? And this really helps us plan. And Grace, after the next slide, I'm going to turn this back over to you so that we can move forward with the second half of the program. If people want to stand up, get a little stretch, maybe grab a cup of coffee like we'd be doing in a real meeting, that would be certainly a good time to do it. Now we have a bunch of things that are coming up in the next week or two, so that's good. One political comment. All right, we will take all of these to heart. And then these results are going to be hidden. I can actually show results, but we've been trying to, as we've learned this, as we've gone along, we've had 1 hour webinars, 3 hour webinars, focused webinars, non-specific webinars. If you could throw a few ideas for us here as to how can we reach and attract more of your colleagues? How can we reach more anesthesiologists, nurses, patients and families, surgeons, cardiologists, whatever it might be, especially trainees. If you could share those ideas with us as we get ready, moving on to the next portion of the show, of the webinar, I, speaking for Grace and Sasha, would very much appreciate it. And now I'm going to turn this back over to Grace to introduce our next two moderators. Thank you all for your participation.
We are very happy to have all of you.
Sasha, you're out of the OR.
Yes,
thank you for joining.
Yes, thank you very much. I think today is a very special day, and I'm very happy to be part of this spectacular activity. So it's time to introduce and to have with us Lorenzo Galletti, who is the director in Rome of the program of pediatric cardiac surgery and pediatric cardiology at Bambino Gesù. Lorenzo, I'm sure you don't need too much presentation, and I'm very happy that you participate and attend to these extraordinary events about the Tetralogy of Fellow. Thank you very much.
The second moderator of this second part of our webinar is Dr. Maria Angelica Binotto, who is the director of the fellowship program at the University of São Paulo Heart Institute. And she was the one who was my first teacher of pediatric cardiology. She told me that a VSD is not a combination of a VSD and a ASD, and she showed me that not all the murmurs are panfocal systolic murmurs. And so she, took me by hand and introduced me to this amazing universe of congenital heart diseases. And she likes to cook when she's not working with the fellows and with her patients at INCOR. And she has a daughter who went to law school with my son. So they were colleagues on the law school. And thanks. So this is going to be an amazing session. Now is with you, Dr. Galletti and Dr. Angelica.
Thank you very much, Sasha. Thank you very much, Grace. Thank you very much, Gil, for the invitation. As I said in a previous occasion, this is a really, really extraordinary way to globalize our specialty. And speaking about globalization, maybe tetralogy is one of the most globalized disease because a substantial amount of expertise is reached in every part of the world. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Krishna Iyer and Dr. Parvati Iyer from New Delhi in India. Dr. Iyer is renowned for his clinical expertise and widespread involvement in cardiac care for children in India, as well in other developing nations. Began the first dedicated pediatric cardiac care program in northern India at Fortis Escort Heart Institute in 1995. He keeps his hand busy because when he's not at work, likes doing carpentry and fixing things around the house, what in French we call bricolage. Dr. Parvati runs the pediatric cardiac intensive care unit at the Fortis Escort Heart Institute and has been doing so since 1995. She's one of the first to do cardiac intensive care in India and was warned by her peers and bosses in Australia that she would perish in India if she does not do intensive care in India. Other than reading fiction and history, her interests include classical dance, both Indian and ballet. So, Dr. Iyer, please go with the talk.
Thank you very much, Dr. Galletti, for that introduction. And I'll share my screen. It's not showing up. Can you see the screen now?
Yes, just need to launch your presentation, but we can see your screen.
Yeah. Can you see the presentation?
For me, not yet.
Mine has frozen, Krishna.
Sorry? Is it showing up?
No, all ours are frozen.
Maybe unshare your screen and start again, please, Krishna.
Yeah, doing that.
There we go.
Showing now?
Yeah, just in presentation mode and we'll be set to go.
Yeah, doing that. Right.
Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you, Gil, and really pleasure to be part of this webinar. Unfortunately, it's always a tough task following on Tom. I think you should be banned from speaking first in any seminar. So Parvati and I are going to be talking about the Indian scenario with Tetralogy of Fellow. I'll talk a brief about the history and talk some surgical aspects, and she'll follow up with some of the management issues with Tetralogy of Fellow. I have no disclosures, and all patient photographs shown are with permission. To touch a bit upon the history of Tetralogy of Fellow surgery in India, these are a few landmarks in congenital heart surgery. You can see that the pot shunt for Tetralogy of Fellow was first done by Dr. Reeve Betts in the Christian Medical College at Vellore, 1951. And the Christian Medical College was equivalent to the Minnesota of Minnesota and US as far as India is concerned. And then as you go down the line, you see that the first repair of Tetralogy of Fellow was done by Dr. Padhi in a hospital in Meerut in 1963. The first open heart surgeries were actually done in 1961. And Dr. Gopinath, who did the first VSD closure, was a trainee of Dr. Reeve Betts at Vellore. And that was Dr. Gopinath. He, in fact, was my guru and my mentor who initiated me into cardiac surgery. And interestingly, as a historical note, Dr. Gopinath was actually a fellow trainee of Dr. Lillihai. So in some way, I could call myself a second generation trainee of Dr. Lillihai, and my association with Tetralogy of Fellow gains more importance that way. So that was the era of the transventricular repair, the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And Dr. Gopinath was instrumental in bringing that to India. It was actually really popularized, and one of the stalwarts of the transventricular repair was Dr. Stanley John, who was a protege of Dr. Gopinath at Vellore. And way back in 1974, he had published the results of the first 100 cases of tetralogy done at that particular point of time, with remarkable mortality of only 12% for that era. And then he followed up with this remarkable paper in Annals of Thoracic Surgery in 1986, where he published the report of the first 200 patients of adult tetralogy, achieving an astounding mortality of 1.3% in the last 5 years of their experience. So that was an era of transventricular repair. And then we moved on to the transatrial approach in the late 80s, early 90s. And the person who was really responsible for popularizing and introducing it was the master of the transatrial transpulmonary repair, Roger Mee, under whom I was fortunate enough to receive training in 1989. And myself, along with other trainees of Roger Mee, brought the transatrial repair to India. And these are some of the early publications in the early 90s from the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, the first randomized trial evaluating transatrial versus transventricular. And that was the actual time that we actually moved into repairing tetralogy of Fellow in infancy. The situation, of course, is now greatly improved. Today, tetralogy remains the commonest cyanotic congenital heart disease operated in India. Approximately 4,000 cases are operated every year across the country. Most units would do 75 to 125 cases per year. There are a couple of centers which do over 300 cases per year. But most units still struggle with the problems of late presentation with this condition. As you're aware, India is a land of huge disparities. This is the most expensive private residence in the world, belongs to Mukesh Ambani, valued at over $1 billion. And it just sits a couple of miles across from the world's largest slum. So you can see that that disparity also affects the way tetralogy presents. You may have patients presenting in the neonatal period, presenting as adolescents in an extremely sick state, or even in adulthood, the first time that they visit the hospital. So that affects the way we treat tetralogy fellow patients. And just to give you a glimpse of what is the age spectrum of the patients that we operate upon, you can see that the vast majority of the patients are between 6 months of age and 18 years. So between 1 year and 18 years, 69% of the patients belong to that age group. And it's only a small proportion of patients, less than 5%, who get operated less than 6 months of age. So much so that in the guidelines of the Pediatric Cardiac Society of India regarding timing of surgery, the elective repair of asymptomatic patients with tetralogy fellow is listed at 6 to 12 months of age. Of course, if an institution prefers to do it earlier, that's up to institution. But by and large, this was the consensus statement of the surgeons in India that they would prefer to do elective repair in asymptomatic patients between 6 and 12 months. I joined the Escorts Heart Institute in 1995, where I established the pediatric cardiac unit, and I've been there in the last 25 years. And this is a brief glimpse at our experience over the 25 years. Close to 2,500 patients of tetralogy operated. And these are the overall outcomes. As you can see, over the last 15 years, our operative mortality has been under 1%. So what I have been learnings from this, we've learned that the successful outcomes defense, of course, not just in tetralogy, but in all our conditions, paying proper attention to these 5 areas: case selections, preoperative preparation, appropriate intraoperative management, quick and accurate repair, and a tailored postoperative care. So a few important highlights in specific to patients who present late. Some of the preoperative checkpoints that one has to look at is to assess the degree of polycythemia and the effect on the hematological system and treat that appropriately. Assiduous search for collaterals, which are not uncommon in these patients. And importantly, we have learned that neuroimaging is important, not just in the neonate, but also in the older patient. So it's not uncommon to see a blood profile like this in one of our patients, a hemoglobin of 24 grams, a hematocrit of 80, and a platelet count of 40,000. So these patients are extremely prone to postoperative bleeding complications, and the most disastrous one can be something like this, where you can have a near fatal or a fatal intracranial hemorrhage. Aortopulmonary collaterals are a major nuisance. If left untreated, they can give major postoperative problems. They can be large in size or they can be small, but even small collaterals can give very troublesome postoperative pulmonary hemorrhage. And surprisingly, many of these patients can be totally asymptomatic and yet have significant lesions like this: intracranial lesions, healed abscesses, healed infarcts. And it's good to have an idea of these preoperatively when you are prepared for an unexpected postoperative neurological event. Intraoperatively, we have learned, and this was always Roger Mee's teaching, that in tetralogy, you should keep the cross-clamp time to the lowest possible. The technique of infundibular resection, to my mind, is the key to a successful tetralogy total correction. And we've learned that pressure measurements of PRV ratio is misguiding. Postoperative echo or intraoperative echo is more important to assess the adequacy of repair. And we've learned very early the concept of leaving a residual dynamic gradient, because we feel that a mild degree of right ventricular outflow tract obstruction preserves the right ventricle in the long term. So as I mentioned, the transatrial resection of the infundibular obstruction is key, and it's always a judgment call as to how much to resect. You resect too little, you leave residual RVOTO. You resect too much, you might end up with right ventricular dysfunction. It's also important that the resection is limited to the parietal band. You would avoid septal bands, and cutting the moderator band is a strict no-no. And we always assess our patients postoperatively. We are very keen, and we develop the the epicardial echocardiography intraoperatively because it gives an excellent view of the right ventricular outflow tract. You can look at the pulmonary valve, the infundibulum. And what we learned was that leaving a dynamic gradient, which essentially meant that there is a systolic compression of the outflow, which relaxes during diastole. And if you have this sort of thing, then even a significant gradient across the right ventricular outflow is acceptable as long as the right ventricular function is not compromised. And we published this in 1999 to basically assess on the basis of echo whether significant gradient intraoperatively needs to be revised or not. Parvati will deal with many of the postoperative learnings that we've had during the 25-year journey with Tetralogy Fellow, but one of the most important issues that we still deal with, which is still a problem for us, is intracranial bleed postoperatively. We've tried to do preoperative CTs, we do frequent monitoring of pupils in the postoperative period, but what we have learned is to have a system of a very rapid response to any pupillary change, which involves an emergency CT scan and a neurosurgical intervention as soon as possible. And we've had a 50% salvage of patients undergoing who had a significant neurological bleeding. This one such adult patient had a massive subdural hematoma. On the second postoperative day, had evacuation of a large clot, improved after that, then had a second bleed 5 days after the first bleed, had a re-intervention again, and then was finally able to be sent home after 4 weeks. So tetralogy still remains a very interesting topic for us. It's been a journey of 40+ years with the tetralogy, and I'm still learning. So thank you very much. I'll pass on to Parvati, who will discuss the postoperative issues with tetralogy.
Krishna, you have to stop your share first.
Yeah, I've done that.
Thank you. I want to add my thanks to both Parvati and Krishna for logging in at this time. What time is it in India right now?
And unmuted, I think.
Must be close to midnight or after. We can see your slides, Parvati.
Can you see my slide?
Yep, there's still an echo though, so if you're not speaking.
Are my slides visible?
Perfect.
Yes, and can you hear me?
Yeah, I think it's an echo between you and Krishna, so if you're not speaking. You're right next to each other. That's great.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Banowski, Dr. Galetti, and all the other faculty. And thanks to the Congenital Heart Academy. Please let me know because my internet, it keeps saying, is unstable. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak on postoperative management of the tetralogy of Fellow in India and whether it's any different. Tetralogy of Fellow has been considered to be a low mortality surgery, both in Europe as well as in the United States, with discharge mortalities of under 2% for the last 2 decades. And there has been very little unit variation as well. But on the other hand, Dr. William Braun stated several years ago that tetralogy of Fellow was really not so simple, and that every tetralogy was potentially different, and that a surgical program could be judged by its outcomes in tetralogy. And this, it seems to be a contradiction to the current perception, which indicates that tetralogy is a standard benchmark operation, low mortality, low risk surgery with very little unit variation. And this is more in keeping with the observations of the paper published in Annals of Thoracic Surgery by the IQIC, which showed a mortality of 3.5%. In this paper, the cause of death was not clearly delineated, but the risk factors identified were malnutrition and preoperative low saturation. So the purpose of my talk is to try and give you a snapshot glimpse of some of the challenges and morbidity encountered in our part of the world and some potential strategies. So in the next few minutes or so, I'm going to touch upon the causes and the reasons for the early mortality in India and possibly in other low middle income countries, a little on the conventional post-operative management and the possible need for a different approach as well, and conclude with the current outcomes in our unit. This article published in Cardiology and the Young details what is late presenting tetralogy and also dwells on some of the issues associated with late presenting tetralogy. What do we mean by late presenting tetralogy? Late presenting tetralogy are those who present late in the natural history and are associated with both pathological and hemodynamic changes in the form of hypercyanosis, polycythemia, and varying degrees of consumptive coagulopathy. So it really has nothing to do with chronological age and has no age or a fixed number as a cutoff. Hypercyanosis or long-standing cyanosis and chronic hypoxemia have sequelae. And these sequelae and secondary responses include polycythemia with secondary hyperviscosity and varying degrees of consumptive coagulopathy. Long-standing severe RVOTO gives rise to severe right ventricular hypertrophy and RV dysfunction. In addition, there are lots of changes associated with chronic hypoxemia in the form of end organ dysfunction, including myocardial dysfunction. There's collateral formation, both large and fine, as well as occult injuries to the brain in the form of cerebral infarcts, bleeds, and abscesses. The compensatory polycythemia, which is associated with chronic hypoxemia and its attendant consumptive coagulopathy, is associated with accelerated fibrinolysis, which in turn is exaggerated by cardiopulmonary bypass, giving rise to fairly difficult to control and life-threatening hemorrhage, which can occur from any side, the worst of which are the lungs as well as vital organs of the brain. India has a huge burden of disease. About 14,000 tetralogies are born each year, and about a third of them have some degree of polycythemia being one of the markers of late presentation. What are the complications and usual cause of death in tetralogy? And this is usually due to low cardiac output state and malignant arrhythmias. Late presenting tetralogy, in addition, have additional unique issues, and this constitutes bleeding from various sides as well as pulmonary bleeding due to multiple reasons and vital organ bleeds. The cause of low cardiac output state in infant tetralogy is due to the right ventricular dysfunction secondary to restrictive right ventricular physiology or a diastolic right ventricular dysfunction. In late tetralogy, biventricular dysfunction is not uncommon, and this is due to a combination of issues: left ventricular volume loading due to collaterals, as well as hypoxemic left ventricular systolic and diastolic dysfunction. This is a schematic diagram of the restrictive physiology detailed in this very elegant landmark paper published by Professor Reddington. And this paper stresses that the goal of postoperative management should focus on establishing an adequate pulmonary antegrade flow. So postoperative restrictive physiology is associated with varying degrees of postoperative right ventricular diastolic dysfunction, and the cardiac output is actually proportional to the diastolic antegrade pulmonary blood flow. Thus, the postoperative management strategies revolve around establishing adequate antegrade pulmonary blood flow in the form of ventilatory or hemodynamic strategies. all of which means that you need to rely heavily on appropriate cardiopulmonary interactions. Yet another landmark and historic paper published 2 decades ago, which showed very clearly that mechanical ventilation in tetralogy of Fallot was associated with the lowest cardiac output possible. And this is probably the worst thing that one can do to a tetralogy, is to keep ventilating. So thus, the post-operative strategy in the intensive care, the ventilatory mantra, involves actually early extubation. And if one needs to ventilate such an infant, we need to ventilate with short inspiratory times or use low positive end expiratory pressure. Just as in this 2-month-old baby, 3.5 kilos, who underwent definitive surgery for tetralogy, was extubated on late 0 post-operative day and was sent home by the 6th post-operative day. And this is in sharp contrast to this 3-year-old, 10 kilo, who was hypoxemic at presentation with a saturation of 62%. This child too was extubated at 4 hours and had increasing tachypnea, needing non-invasive ventilation, and was subsequently re-intubated 11 hours later. At the time of intubation, there was copious pink frothy secretions. A detailed investigation had excluded all collaterals, and this was thought to be due to a reperfusion injury. The lungs got worse, and this is the X-ray on the right-hand side on the 3rd post-operative day. All of this needed humongous amounts of ventilation with a PEEP of 11 and very high mean airway pressures, and the child was finally discharged on the 15th post-operative day. This picture shows you what MAPCA-related lung bleeds look like, again making post-operative ventilation a challenge, and reiterates why collaterals need to be embolized preoperatively. And this is the basis of our preemptive approach today, where MAPCAs are assiduously looked for and multiple collaterals blocked preoperatively, so that in many patients, the post-operative course is actually a big sale. Coming to APGAs. APGAs, or aortopulmonary collaterals, these are fine collaterals which cause a collective left ventricular volume loading, and on the operating table, torrential left atrial return is observed, even if no major collaterals are identified on imaging preoperatively. The effect of APGAs can also be fairly disastrous, and there are varying degrees of endotracheal bleed and lung extravasation, all of which can need prolonged ventilation with PEEP, and a lot of non-invasive ventilation following extubation. And this again makes management of hemodynamics a struggling and a balancing act. So in summary, really, in many late tetralogies, high PEEP and mechanical ventilation is often needed. And this is in contradistinction to traditional wisdom, which advocates early extubation and avoidance of PEEP. Likewise, the traditional hemodynamic approach is quite simple. It is really addressing right ventricular diastolic dysfunction in the postoperative period and focuses on gentle volume augmentation and prevention and control of tachycardia, and in occasional units by use of a beta blocker therapy. On the other hand, in our part of the world, in a 10-year-old tetralogy is often associated with biventricular dysfunction, and this management is not quite so simple because there is right ventricular diastolic dysfunction along with left ventricular systolic and diastolic dysfunction, and very often multiple drugs are required. So in postoperative late tetralogy, the low cardiac output is due to a combination of factors, and the treatment is not so simple. It needs to be highly individualized. And what drugs to be used? The different drugs can be used for different scenarios, and very often a combination of multiple drugs need to be used, and occasionally everything in the kitchen sink needs to be thrown at them. What is the most dreaded complication? That is of intracranial bleeds. We had 6 instances out of 991 surgeries in an 8-year time frame. 3 of them were posterior fossa bleeds, 2 subdural and 1 extradural. 5 underwent neurosurgery. We had intact survival in 4 out of the 6. These are the 2 who died. It was a large subdural bleed shortly after admission into the intensive care unit, and the other a large cerebellar bleed, again shortly after arrival from the operating room. This child illustrates a catastrophic near miss. He was a polycythemic tetralogy, had a postoperative posterior fossa bleed needing imminent neurosurgery. And the only sign clinically was a mild inequality in pupils, which was noticed by the bedside nurse. And it is she who really salvaged this child. And this child was saved due to timely diagnosis and surgery. 2 other survivors of neurosurgery. Again, the only clue was mild drowsiness after extubation and a doubtful inequality of pupils. This Krishna has already discussed, but this was also a near miss despite meticulous preoperative preparation. And this is what we'd like to reiterate, that you can do everything right. It was a polycythemic 26-year-old college student. He had a preoperative CT scan of the head, which was normal. He had large collaterals, which were coiled preoperatively. The surgery was smooth. He had some mediastinal bleeding and gastrointestinal bleeding, all of which were easily controlled. Mercifully, no endotracheal bleeding, but he had 2 subdural bleeds, one after the other, requiring 2 neurosurgical procedures. Even though the mortality for tetralogy in our unit has declined precipitously over the last 2.5 decades, coming from 3.5% to well under 1%, what is disconcerting is the fact that out of the various 6 deaths, 2 were due to intracranial bleeds, the other 2 were due to dengue and dengue-like illness, and only 1 had a cardiac death. So in summary, and to conclude, postoperative tetralogy in India and possibly other low-middle-income countries is really associated with myriad other issues far beyond the concept of a restrictive right ventricular physiology. The management strategies, therefore, need to be tailored to the individual patient and physiology. And a lot of these things may be contrary to traditional teaching and practice. A highly preemptive approach may reduce the incidence and morbidity due to intracranial bleeds. Preoperative polycythemia, however, continues to be a risk factor for bleeding and be a cause of complex low cardiac output state. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thanks, Parvati. Maria, I think you're up. We need to unmute your microphone. And Parvati, if you could stop the screen share, please, that would be great.
So thank you, Dr. Iyer. And I thank you all for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here in this such a nice webinar. And so it's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Ogo Sokombi. She is a lecturer in pediatrics and pediatric cardiology at the College of Medicine, University of Lagos, Nigeria, and consultant pediatrician and interventional pediatric cardiologist at the Lagos University Teaching Hospital in Lagos, Nigeria. Ogo, when she's not practicing pediatric cardiology, she's listening to music. So Ogo is going to talk to us about the management of tetralogy of Fallot in Nigeria. So it's with you, Ogo, please.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen, please?
Looks great, Ogo. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I bring greetings from Lagos, Nigeria, and I'm so grateful to Congenital Heart Academy for this opportunity to discuss the management of tetralogy of Fallot in Nigeria. I have no disclosures. Nigeria is located in the western coast of Africa and occupies about 900,000 square kilometers. It's the most populous country in Africa and has a fast-growing population estimated at about 200 million. Basically has 6 major geopolitical zones and 36 states, and majorly healthcare services are more prevalent in the southern compared to the northern part, and population density is also much higher in the southern part. Unfortunately, there's no congenital heart disease database in Nigeria currently, but I tried to put together the prevalence of congenital heart disease from different studies in different parts of Nigeria, and the prevalence comes to about 7 to 18 per thousand, and about 70,000 children are born with CHD in Nigeria annually. However, there was a
Ogo, excuse me for interrupting, Ogo. Are you advancing your slides or are you still on your title slide? They don't seem to be
advancing. Okay. Okay, I'm advancing actually. Okay, should I go again?
Yeah, why don't you stop the screen share and start again? Let's see if that will work.
Okay.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No problem, it's fine, Dr. Gill. Let me just go to PowerPoint and I'll reshare. I have to stop screen sharing.
We can see your Nigeria slide there. Okay.
Now, okay, is it moving forward?
I see the Nigeria slide. Move it. Yes, now it's moving. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. So there was a pilot national pediatric cardiac registry, and the preliminary data was taken from January to December 2014. 1,296 patients were enrolled in this registry, and 12% of the patients with CHD had tetralogy of Fallot. The mean age of enrollment was 4.6 years, and just 16% of children of the patients had had surgical correction for CHD, and only 20% of them had been done locally. And only about a quarter of these patients who had undergone correction had tetralogy of Fallot. Recently, we inaugurated the Nigerian Society of Pediatric Cardiology, and we just concluded our conference. So it is hoped that with great frontiers like this, we'll be able to put together a registry and move forward the care of the child with congenital heart disease. So the prevalence of TOF in Nigeria is about 8 to 16%, and it makes up about half of the cyanotic congenital heart disease from different studies from Nigeria. There was an audit of availability and distribution of pediatric cardiology services carried out in 2016 and was reported in the Cardiovascular Journal of Africa. And as we can see, although echocardiography services were distributed in most parts of the country, the centers performing open heart surgery and also availability of cardiac cath labs were mainly concentrated in the southern part of the country. Currently, about 48 centers in the country provide pediatric cardiology services. About 12 centers provide open heart surgery services, but there are only 2 working centers providing pediatric open heart surgery, and only 1 or 2 centers performing routine pediatric cardiac catheterization. The Nigerian child with tetralogy of Fallot mainly has his or her fate decided by the cost of intervention. So whether a child has surgery or doesn't have surgery is determined by the cost. Sadly, a lot of patients have to undergo care from out-of-pocket payment. Health insurance is largely inadequate, and even when it is present, it is poorly subscribed to. So most of the children have sponsored surgeries, and this is by family, friends, and well-meaning individuals. There are very few walk-in centers, and the private centers still take precedence, and this makes it more expensive. The timing of tetralogy of Fallot is mainly determined by the age of presentation, which is usually late in the Nigerian child, and intracardiac repair is usually beyond the first year of life. Occasionally, the frequency of spells makes the surgeon bring in the child earlier, or the physician refer to the surgeon earlier. But basically, the child is asymptomatic. Many physicians and surgeons prefer to wait till beyond the first year of life. Needless to say that there's a long waiting list from the missions, and also when you have only 2 working centers serving 200 million people, a long list is inevitable. Thankfully, the BTT shunt is rarely performed in children with tetralogy of Fallot. It has a limited utility, and a lot of times the journey to the OR for the Nigerian child is a long and winding one. So the need for reoperation in the future after a BTT shunt usually makes it a road less traveled. Occasionally during mission trips, because teams want to avoid prolonged ICU stay, for borderline cases, the BTT shunt is favored. Preoperative assessment for tetralogy of Fallot in Nigeria mainly involves using the transthoracic echocardiography. That's usually the bane for the assessment. CT pulmonary angiograms are present in about half of the centers, but cardiac catheterization is only available in about 1 or 2 centers. And in fact, the 2 major centers performing pediatric cardiac services in Nigeria depend on services from 1 cardiac catheterization lab. And the Magoon and Nakata indices are usually used to determine whether a palliative BT shunt or a full intracardiac repair is done. And the cutoff of about -2 is usually used. This shows the indications for cardiac catheterization in patients with tetralogy of Fallot, mostly diagnostic, and branch PA assessment and also abnormal coronaries are among the indications for cardiac cath in children with TOF. RVOT stenting is yet to be reported in any center in Nigeria. Open heart surgery is currently performed in about 12 centers, and only 2 of these centers are working. Medical tourism is a huge competition for local cardiac care, and also the expertise for intensive care is sparse, which is usually the rate limiting point in many of the centers. Unlike congenital heart disease, there is a Nigerian open heart surgery registry, which was pioneered and is being managed by Dr. Bode Falashe. Thanks to him, he's a consultant cardiothoracic surgeon at Lagos State University Teaching Hospital. And this shows the adult and pediatric cases that have been done since the registry was commenced for data since about 2015. And we can see here majority of the pediatric cardiac surgeries were performed by 2 major centers, the Babcock Tri-State Group in southwestern Nigeria and the OAU-TCH group also in southwestern Nigeria. So this also shows the data for the 2 major pediatric cardiac centers in the country. And as we can see here in 2020, for the second group, there was a drastic drop in their cases because this group at Eleife also does missions in addition to independent surgeries. So with the COVID pandemic, we could see that the cases done dropped to about half because the mission teams were not available due to the COVID pandemic. This is Nigerian Open Heart Registry also showing the distribution of cases. And here we can see about 68 patients have been entered since year 2015. So I'd just like to give the data from the 2 major pediatric cardiac centers in Nigeria. The BTT shunt, like I mentioned, is unpopular. Only 5% of the total patients operated for TOF had a BT shunt. And as we can see from this map, sadly, the only 2 centers providing working services are in southwestern Nigeria, and they are side by side, leaving the rest of the country starved. For the first unit, which operates both mission and independent lists, the mean age of presentation for children with TOF was 4.7 years. The mean age at repair was about 5 years, and none of the patients were operated in infancy. Mortality after ICR was about 10%, and the death was mainly as a result of arrhythmias and cardiac dysfunction. There was 100% mortality in patients who underwent BT shunts, and the follow-up is just about 4 years. As we can see also from the second center, the Babcock Tri-State Group, 66% of the patients had total correction, just 3% of the patients had BTT shunts, and 26% are yet to have surgery. 5% of these patients were referred only for cardiac catheterization and referred back to their referral centers. The mean age here at presentation was about 7 years. Mean age at repair again was mid-childhood, 5 years. But in this group, they had few patients who were operated before the first year of life. Mortality following BTT shunts was nil, but the 2 patients who had BT shunts were 23 and 27 years respectively, and they had severe, markedly hypoplastic branch pulmonary arteries, which could not be managed with a full intracardiac repair. One of such patients has had his complete repair done 3 months after. This is to show the mortality at one of the centers. Right ventricular dysfunction took the lead, and acute lung injury from reperfusion also had equal cause of mortality, side-by-side right ventricular dysfunction. Mortality, putting all the age groups together following ICR, was about 18%. Mortality in the post-infancy group was about 14%. Mortality among infants was a dismal 50%, and among adolescents and adults, 25%. But for childhood repair, removing the extremes of age, the average mortality was 12.5% following ICR. So the mid-modal ICR age is about mid-childhood. The use of transannular or subannular patch is mainly decided by the Z-score of the pulmonary valve, either from CT or cardiac catheterization or echocardiography, where it's reliable. Leaving PFO is almost universal because most of the children would have severely hypertrophied right ventricles, which are almost 100% prone to dysfunction. And post-op inotropes usually would include milrinone, which is the standard, and then epinephrine also to balance that. And this is usually continued for about the first 72 to 96 hours post-op. RV dysfunction is almost universally present because the patients are older. On-table extubation is not a usual practice. Extubation is usually beyond the first 12 hours post-operatively, and the average ICU stay in the Nigerian patient is about 4 days, with 3 to 4 days step down before discharge. This shows the complications following ICR for TOF in one of the centers. And this shows transfusional malaria as a major factor. This is a malaria endemic zone, and many of these children who undergo blood transfusion come down with malaria, which is a very prevalent post-operative complication in children in the ICU. The discharge medications will range from diuretic to ACE inhibitors, and the follow-up is usually by yearly electrocardiograms and echocardiograms, and most of the times, and sometimes, few times, there are post-op residuals, free PR and residual stenosis, and there are usually issues about the goals on follow-up. Pulmonary valve replacement post-tetralogy of Fallot in Nigeria, it's unsure if this is an elephant in the room, but probably there might have been self-selection of patients not requiring transannular patch. I say this because a lot of the patients who are operated in Nigeria end up with subannular patches. So could it be that those children with severe pulmonary valve obstructions have actually been naturally selected and don't get to the OR? The surgical correction of congenital heart disease actually started early to mid-2000s in Nigeria, with many of the referrals abroad. So patients who require pulmonary valve replacement are actually a growing population. And with time, we'll get to see these children probably in the next couple of years. Cardiac MRI is currently unavailable, and so non-invasive means have to be utilized in order to decide the indications for pulmonary valve replacement after TOF repair. But the usual practice is medical management once significant right ventricular dilatation sets in. Again, cost will be a major decision to decide whether it's a reoperation or transcatheter PVR. There's also the issue of tetralogy of Fallot repair in special populations. Genetics is still taking baby steps in Nigeria. We generally operate on all children with congenital heart disease as long as their parents can afford it and it's safe for them. So children with Down syndrome trisomy 21 are usually not discriminated against for surgery. Legion syndrome is not usually diagnosed genetically, but the facies and also the calcium levels may be a pointer to the presence of this syndrome, and special care is taken for these children to maintain their calcium levels intraoperatively, excuse me, and also to monitor their neurological functioning even post-repair. So there are certain peculiarities in the Nigerian child with TOF. The questions arise, is RV dysfunction more severe? Definitely. Do we need to be more aggressive about the management? The currently used drugs, are they that helpful, or do we need to look for more aggressive more aggressive pharmacological management. Then there's also the issue of a worse preoperative stage for these children, as Dr. Aya mentioned, coming in with severe cyanosis, polycythemia. Many of these children have a worse preoperative state than will be seen in the average population in a developed country. And then is younger truly better? One of the centers recorded about 50% mortality. So really in these children, is it better to operate much earlier? An acute lung injury from reperfusion is the reality rather than the rarity in the children who undergo ICR for TOF in the developing country. Less invasive monitoring is needed to decide on when to refer a child for pulmonary valve replacement. And then the issue of counseling also arises. What is too little? What is too much? Sometimes you want to tell the parents all that the child is going to go through the full haul, but then you also don't want to discourage them, because sometimes so much information may pose the question of why do it in the first place. The road to the OR for the Nigerian child is a long one, full with obstacles, and that needs to be considered so that the best shot is given at any time. Without surgery, it's a long, tiring journey of tireless outpatient visits, infective endocarditis prophylaxis, oral beta blockers, iron supplementations, liberal fluid intake, a high indices of suspicion for CVAs, cerebrovascular accidents, infective endocarditis, then the repeated exchange blood transfusions with saline replacement, regular blood counts. It's actually a vicious cycle. Self-reliance and sustainability is key, and the COVID pandemic has actually taught us in the developing world that we need to do more for ourselves, with ourselves, by ourselves, for ourselves. And in as much as help from the developed world is much appreciated, it's important that we scale up our services in the face of a global scale down, as has been demonstrated in year 2020. So finally, the Nigerian population with TOF is peculiar. They are older, more ill. Early ICR in mid-infancy may improve outcomes, but there are still the questions of how early is too early. British Shunt, thankfully, has limited utility. We are grateful for what it has done for people like Mike Elborn up until now, but we are glad that we have moved forward even in Nigeria. Cost of surgery is still a major factor with decides care. Access to care is still a problem, but self-reliance and sustainability is currently the major thrust. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Ogo. Lorenzo, before you introduce the next speaker, if I could just remind everyone that and Nancy, you can pull your slides up in the meantime. I just want to let everybody know 1 week from today, we have the second part of this webinar, which will include Dr. Bonhoeffer talking about the original development of the transcatheter pulmonary valve, which has been mentioned in a number of our prior talks, as well as talk from Bratislava, the Slovak Republic, from Dr. Olejnik and Dr. Kluzo from Munich. So we have Italy, the Slovak Republic, and Germany. And then in the second half, we'll be talking about neurodevelopmental outcomes, the arrhythmia burden by Dr. Charles Barul, and follow-up strategies by Dr. Downing. So I hope you can all join us in 1 week, and I'll give the floor back to you, Lorenzo.
Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nancy Poirier from Montreal, Canada. Nancy is professor on surgery, both at the Division of Cardiac Surgery at the University of Montreal, and also ran as a head cardiac surgery at the Centre Universitaire Hospitalier Saint-Justin, where she also director of pediatric cardiac transplantation and VATS program. Her practice include also management of adult of congenital heart disease, as well adult with other acquired cardiac disease. More important, she also founded the CINC, Clinique d'Investigation Neurocardiaque at Saint-Justin, that evaluates and provides early intervention for infants undergoing cardiac surgery. She's also co-founder of Saint-Justin au Cœur du Monde, added a number of humanitarian missions over the last 15 years, operating hundreds of children in Morocco, China, India, Egypt, Ethiopia, and now is running activity in Senegal. Dr. Poirier is also a sport a sportwoman, endurance sport, running marathon, has been qualified for Boston Marathon, cycling, and cross-country skiing. Thank you very much, Dr. Poirier. Please.
Thank you. Can you see my slides?
They're perfect, and we can hear you perfectly, Nancy. Thank you.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you very much for this invitation and being part of this global discussion about Tetralogy of Fallot. And I must say that I enjoyed the last presentations because with actually the first time I operated abroad and did my first fellows were in Chennai, India. So hearing how they're doing so well, and 20 years later, because that was 20 years later before, it's really very interesting. But today I will be talking about the tendencies in practice in areas where there are resources and in the developing countries. I have no disclosures. And so yesterday was the 76th anniversary of the first Blalock-Taussig Shunt, or the BTT Shunt, I should say, and marked the beginning of cardiac surgery that helped a number of children. Here, I'm just going to try to, here we go. And it was really the mainstay for the treatment of Tetralogy of Fallot till 10 years later, when Dr. Lillehei, with cross circulation, with actually a volunteer from the town of the 11-year-old child that was corrected for Tetralogy of Fallot, was successfully repaired. We saw these images. These are from a 1955 publication where he showed his technique. And we have here the first 10 patients that were corrected for Tetralogy of Fallot by Dr. De Lillehei on cross circulation. And he had a 60% success rate. Now, with the advent of cardiopulmonary bypass and improvement in perioperative care, there were less and less BT shunts that were performed to palliate these children. And actually, this is a publication from 2007 that shows the whole experience of Johns Hopkins. And we see that they used to be doing close to 150 cases per year in the 1940s for the Tetralogy of Fallot with a 15% mortality. And these numbers went down as intracardiac repair went up. And we see here in the 90s and 2000s, these are not for Fallots, but more for univentricular hearts. This is an important paper that was published in 1977, and with the always improvement in perioperative care, it was shown that it was possible to operate children without prior palliation for Tetralogy of Fallot, and there was a cutoff, and this is where we started talking about doing these electively at 4 to 6 months. This was a paper from Boston. And this is the last executive summary from the STS. And so we've gone from having mortalities, as you saw before, that could go into the 15 to 20% mark to the last executive showing from 2015 to 2018 in a large number of Tetralogy of Fallot. Actually, it's the second or equal in a number of patients that are operated in North America with mortalities that are quite low. And so we see here with the transannular patch, you'll have under 2% at 1.6% and under 1% if you're able to do a repair with no transannular patch or ventriculotomy. This is a systematic review and meta-analysis that was performed by a group in the Netherlands that looked at the contemporary literature. And actually, this is very interesting because they actually show the scope of the review that they did, and also showed that the mortality is consistently under 5% in the contemporary literature wherever you look in the world. However, we see here that sub-Saharan Africa is not represented here. Very little literature from Latin America and none from the USSR. So it was a systematic review looking at the contemporary outcomes of correction of tetralogy of Fallot. They had 137 unique cohorts. It's over 20,000 patients with a mean follow-up of 8.7 years. And they had, and through this literature, we could see that there was a mean age that was of correction at 6 months. And there was pooled estimates of mortality that was early at 2.8%, late at 0.42% per year, with valve-related mortality that's mentioned here, and a reintervention rate that is not non-negligible, and that is 2.26% per year. They also looked at the tendency in practice. And so we see here that prior palliation is under 10% in this literature, that transannular patching has remained at about 50% throughout the years, and transventricular approach has been on the decrease. So in this meta-analysis, and when we look at the literature, there is definitely a tendency towards preserving the pulmonary valve, as mentioned before. And so whether we do a transannular or we preserve the pulmonary valve, the survival seems to be the same as shown here in this multi-center study performed in the Netherlands. However, we see that the event-free survival favors preserving the pulmonary valve, with a lot of valve-related reinterventions that appear in late adolescence and young adult age. And this also a very important paper that was published in Lancet has shown that doing a transannular patch and prior palliation comes with arrhythmia problems with ventricular tachyarrhythmia, sudden death, and atrial arrhythmias. So if we look at the contemporary literature, it is still of contrary, and there's different details that I will not get into. However, I think it's safe to say that a repair will be safely performed in infants without prior palliation. Elective repairs tend to be done between 5 and 12 years. There's avoidance of deep cyanosis and recurrent spells, and that is an absolute indication. And pulmonary valve preservation is done whenever possible. And if there's transannular patches that need to be done, it's usually in the presence of a hypoplastic annulus, and this seems to be the length or the importance of this patching is kept to a minimum. There is definitely a need for long-term follow-up, whether we have preserved this pulmonary valve or have done a transannular patch, because there is a high incidence in reintervention. So if we look at once more at the executive summary and look at the neonates, the patients that are that need intervention less than 30 days of life, and in the last, well, between 2015 and 2018, it's a very small number of patients with either pulmonary atresia or pulmonary stenosis that have presented cyanosis. And if we look at the mortalities, they're a little higher with a transannular patch performed in a neonate going with a mortality of about 3%, and for pulmonary atresia with VSD at about 2.7%. The shunting here is might be done for a tetralogy of Fallot, but probably for the most part is performed in univentricular physiology. So if we look at the literature to see when whether a patient should be palliated or not, there are a few meta-analyses that have been done in the literature, and this being one of them. However, it shows here in this study that was published in 2017 that the hospital length of stay was less, ICU stay was less, and ventilation time was also less important in the patients that we were able to go beyond the neonatal period. However, none of these are able to show us the linear effect of having done the palliation and on the long-term results. And this important paper came out just last year, and tried to address this issue. It was published by the team at CHOP and looked at a retrospective cohort study that looked at pediatric health information system data. It is an administrative database looking at data from 2004 to 2015. And they were able to identify 2,363 patients. And they looked at the neonates that were presented for symptomatic tetralogy and fellow, and tried to compare whether complete repair was done in the neonatal period or whether a staged procedure, if there were differences in outcome. The figure on your left looked at the initial procedure, meaning whether you had done a palliative procedure or the correction, and looked at the early postoperative mortality. Now, the weighted survival curve showed a better 30-day survival in patients that were staged. And this tendency or weighted survival curve at 2 years also favored a staged repair. Now, if we look at the characteristics that were considered, or the factors that were considered in this weighted survival, we see here that they took into consideration the race, whether it was private or public funding, genetic extracardiac anomalies, whether there's prematurity, weight, and if they came in as an acute patient with prostaglandins, and the age at first procedure. Now, this brought about a slew of commentary, Glenn Van Arsdale in JACC, and there were also 2 expert comments that were done in the GTCVS, one by Chuck Fraser, who was more of a proponent for palliative or staged repair, and Dr. Jonas for neonatal repair. And I tried to make a summary as to the take-home messages, not only of this paper, but also of the comments. And there were many comments on the limitations of an administrative database, and that the heterogeneity of the population might not have been well outlined. Also, if you look at the paper closely, that the follow-up was incomplete in both groups. Not all tetralogy fellow were alike, and there was a definite comment on the need for a tailored approach. And I think it's safe to say, as a summary, that if a patient is symptomatic term, no extracardiac issues, greater than 2.5 kilos with good PAs in a center that's comfortable in addressing neonatal tetralogy of fellow, then the tendency would be towards a repair. And a stage repair, either cath-based or surgical, may have a positive effect on survival. And that stage approach should be considered in high-risk patients, as mentioned in the paper, that maybe under 2.5 kilos, the premature baby, extra cardiac conditions or syndromes associated, and conditions precluding CPB with hypoplastic PAs should maybe be doing a staged report. The lifelong follow-up also is suggested, since there is a high reintervention rate in these patients. So if we look closely at these options that we have to palliation other than the BT shunt, well, there is the PA stenting. This is one of the bigger studies that was published by the Congenital Catheterization Research Collaborative, and from 4 centers looked at these patients that are of high risk. We see that there's a huge number of premature babies with low birth rates, with have genetic syndromes and other conditions that were included here. Now, if we look at the BT shunt group, which was 70% of the patients, expected two ventricular physiology was the minority. So these BT shunts were for univentricular patients, and there were fewer patients with antegrade pulmonary flow, meaning pulmonary atresia. and the PDA group had more of the tetralogy of Fallot like physiology with antegrade flow. When adjusted for center, expected ultimate physiology, antegrade pulmonary flow, anatomic diagnosis, and pre-intervention in inotrope use and pre-intervention ventilation, there were no differences in their death rates. And as for ICU, hospital stay, pulmonary artery symmetry, and Nakata improvement, there seemed to be favorable for the stented ductus. Another alternative to the BT shunt is RV outflow tract stenting. One of the bigger studies was published in JACC Intervention in 2017 and comes from Birmingham. And we see here in 78 patients, there was either a BT shunt that was performed or an RV outflow tract stent was placed. Here on your right, we see the progression of the left PA and the right PA dimensions. And we seem to have a greater improvement in the size in PAs with the RV stenting compared to the BT shunt. However, having tried to resect these stents during a subsequent complete repair, we know that there's extensive circumferential fibrosis, and at stent ablation, there's scarring and there's a high possibility of injuring structures, either the aortic valve or the tricuspid valve. Also, we know that this area is very arrhythmogenic, and then there's a possibility of inducing arrhythmias. And naturally, there's no stenting that's possible with anomalous coronaries. So an alternative to this was proposed by the Paris group, and trying to establish an increased antegrade flow and providing a saturation in PA growth, but more importantly, preparing a future biventricular repair without using a conduit. And we see here illustrations showing that there's a ventriculotomy that's performed. And these are patients that have pulmonary atresia or very, very hypoplastic pulmonary valves. So there is a transannular procedure that is performed. We're opening up the main PA. And if there is actually opening a virtual passage towards the RV, and if there's complete disconnection of the PAs with the right ventricle, using the left atrial appendage to act as patching material for the posterior portion and adding an anterior patch. That's measured to give an internal diameter of 5 to 6 millimeters. The data that was presented in this paper in 2017 showed that there was significant improvement in the Nakata index in these patients, and quickly also. So they had compared this to a prior BT shunt group, and showed that they could also have, with quicker, not only a better score or Nakata index, but attained it more rapidly. With survival shown here on the left, that was equivalent to the BT shunt. And actually, when they teased out the patients with chromosomic abnormalities, they had an even better result with the RV to PA reconstruction. We see here that there's certain weaknesses with the RV to PA connection, with a higher morbidity in the initial experience. They were making the patches a little too wide and also thinning out the RV, which created the possibility of false aneurysm. Now we used the same technique with their experience and knowing that we should be more restricted, keeping these patch diameters or the outflow diameter to 6 millimeters and not thinning out the RV. And in our initial study. We have 20 patients that we've had since 2017 to 2020 with the median weight that's shown here. Now, we've done this mostly in pulmonary atresia patients, but also in a number of very hypoplastic annulus with small PAs. There was one mortality in a patient that had a syndrome that weighed 2 kilos. And this was at the initial procedure. There was no interstage death, and 15 of the 20 have undergone correction at a mean interval of 268 days, and there's no postoperative mortality. So we're very encouraged by this procedure. So in the neonates in developed countries, these are more severe forms, and this goes all the way to pulmonary atresia. Risk factors for repair are often present in these patients. So maybe a staged approach should be considered. If it's not a surgical shunt, then maybe cath-based alternative or this restrictive transannular patch. And these patients also have to be followed for their long-term, not only for their cardiac late complications, but also for their neurodevelopment. Thank you. Was I on time?
Perfect, Nancy. Thank you.
That's under 5 coffees. So I.
I'll go back to Maria Angelica. Thank you.
So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Darren Klugman. He's the Director of Pediatric Cardiac Critical Care and the Director of Quality and Safety at the Blalock-Taussig-Thomas Pediatric and Congenital Heart Center. He also serves as the Secretary for the Pediatric Cardiac Intensive Care Society and serves on the Executive Committee for the Pediatric Cardiac Critical Care Consortium. When he's not working, Darren enjoys fishing, smoking meat, and is a terribly misguided fan of the Dallas Cowboys. So go ahead, Darren. Thank you.
Sorry, Darren, I had to add that.
Thank you, Gil. I wouldn't feel complete had you not added that at the end of this introduction. Nonetheless, it's a huge honor to be a part of this here today, and I am humbled not only to be a part of this panel, but to be in the building where this historical work took place, and have the privilege of virtually meeting Michael Edinburgh, who has been such a tremendous advocate for congenital heart disease and such a huge voice for all of us. I'm going to speak about the postoperative care of the neonate and infant with tetralogy of Fallot in developed countries. I'm assuming you guys can see my slides. Great.
Yes.
Great.
Advanced one, yeah, perfect.
I have no disclosures. We're today, in the next 15 minutes or so, we're going to review the OR to CICU handoff process, understand junctional ectopic tachycardia in the postoperative patient, review restrictive RV physiology, and then take a brief walk through history and say thank you to some very important folks. One of the things I often say is that the key to exceptional postoperative care is the ability for us to be proactive rather than reactive. Reactivity in our world is usually met in a very unforgiving fashion by our patients, especially as our patient complexity has increased over time. Gil has become an incredibly close friend and taught me more than anybody the importance of the fact that exceptional postoperative care starts well before the patient arrives in the intensive care unit, and an intimate understanding of the patient's preoperative anatomy and physiology is paramount in order to take optimal care of them postnatally. In this letter written about Michael Edinburgh prior to his arrival here at Johns Hopkins at the age of 2 years and 7 months, some notable features of his clinical state are outlined and underlined here in red. His blood count had increased 25%. Michael had marked discoloration of the nails of both extremities with clubbing, as he pointed out in his story of the bully at the school. And in ways that we don't often see in the developed world, it's underlined here at the bottom of this letter that his favorite position at all times is the squat. And remarkably, he actually even preferred sleeping in a squatting position. All of these features of his preoperative course would be important to understand how best to care for a patient like Michael post-operatively. The devil is always in the details, and the proverbial operating room as a black box is something that has largely, thankfully, become a thing of the past and needs to be continued to remain that way. Intimate understanding of what happens in the operating room is vital for us in the ICU. Patients with cyanotic tetralogy of Fallot present with pressure-loaded right ventricles and often volume-unloaded left ventricles, which have important ramifications in their postoperative course and the postoperative performance, not only of the right, but the left ventricle as well. Conversely, patients with tetralogy of Fallot and VSD physiology, otherwise known as the pink tet, often have mildly pressure-loaded right ventricles with volume-loaded left ventricles and a postoperative course that will likely resemble that of a VSD repair and not mostly that of a tetralogy repair. Elements of the operative course that are important to understand as ICU providers and as cardiologists caring for these patients include, but are not limited to, the transatrial approach for repair of the VSD and right ventricular outflow obstruction, as has been eloquently described by multiple prior presenters, the presence or absence of an RV infundibular incision, which has implications for RV performance, a patch augmentation of the right ventricular outflow tract, which often leaves the pulmonary valve incompetent, the valve sparing approach as very nicely described by Dr. Carl, and then of course all of the elements of the bypass procedure, including cross-clamp time and any complications that occur as a result. The first opportunity to really have challenges with transmitting this important information from the operating room to the staff in the ICU occurs at handoff. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about a point in time during which we all are aware is fraught with opportunities for misinformation, loss of information, and errors to occur. In what I consider a hallmark paper performed by the team in the Great Ormond Street, and who first described the importance of this and reconfigured their OR to CICU handoff based on Formula One racing pit stop crews, they began to highlight for all of us how rethinking the way we do these handoffs and refocusing our energies on the importance of this moment can lead to important outcomes. And what this team did is studied 50 teams and 50 handoffs before and after the implementation of a modified OR to CICU handoff protocol modeled after Formula One racing pit crews. And what they noticed in the 27 teams they studied after implementation of this, that in fact, there was a significant reduction in omissions and technical errors at the time of handoff. In an additionally important work performed by my former colleagues at Children's National, led by Christine Riley, the team reconfigured the OR to CICU handoff practice at Children's National in this diagram that is shown here. And this manuscript really focuses not only on the importance of the handoff process, but on the necessity to sustain these changes once implemented. And what Christine and her team were able to demonstrate was that over a four-year period with multidisciplinary engagement and interdisciplinary buy-in with ongoing performance improvement and quality improvement efforts, there's a sustainment of gains over 4 years. Some of the key elements in this work are not only the organization of the room as highlighted in this diagram, but also the real focus on an environment that is kept pristine with order and silence and the same rigor with every single OR to CICU handoff. It really is an important way to minimize loss of information and errors as the patients come to us from the OR and begin their care in the ICU. We're going to spend one of the more important elements, as has been described by others as well, of patients in the postoperative period with tetralogy is the arrhythmia known as junctional ectopic tachycardia, as shown on this ECG. Junctional ectopic tachycardia, as most of us know, is marked by AV dissociation. And in many of the younger patients that we take care of, because of a very healthy AV node, these patients have rapid retrograde conduction. And so there may not be AV dissociation as we think of it, but rather retrograde conduction across that AV node. This arrhythmia is an automatic one and generally warms up as narrow, complex, and has a QRS morphology very similar to the patient's baseline at a rate greater than 150. One of the diagnostic tools that is particularly helpful in the intensive care unit is the use of an atrial electrogram, which involves the attachment of the atrial pacing wires to the ECG. And as noted on this EKG shown here, you can see the black arrows denoting atrial pacing spikes buried within the QRS, indicative of the AV dissociation noted in the definition. The junctional ectopic tachycardia has been well described in Tetralogy of Fallot. In this single center study from a center in the Middle East, they examined over 300 patients under 2 years of age. 22% had pulmonary valvotomy, and the majority via transatrial approach. On multivariate analysis, this group demonstrated that younger age at repair, preoperative cyanosis, and a higher preoperative heart rate were associated with increased likelihood of JET. And JET was associated, as has been demonstrated in other studies, with an increased ICU length of stay. And these investigators examined 324 consecutive patients who had postoperative JET, and then did a subsequent sub-analysis of the nearly 22% of the patients with Tetralogy of Fallot who made up the initial patient cohort. These investigators found that RV muscle bundle resections and higher cardiopulmonary bypass temperature were associated with increased likelihood of JET postoperatively. And interestingly, the transatrial approach of the right ventricular outflow tract obstruction did not have significant association with postoperative JET. This post-mortem graphic from the manuscript demonstrates some subendocardial hemorrhage as highlighted by the arrow, which is one of the theoretical underpinnings of postoperative JET, in addition to other possible etiologies, including stretching of the tricuspid valve annulus and transient damage to the bundle of His. In a survey of 30 centers across Germany, Switzerland, and Austria, with a 100% response rate, these investigators sought to understand what the typical postoperative management of JET was. What they were able to determine is that the majority of centers used amiodarone as their primary antiarrhythmic, but as you'll note in this graph, there are multiple different treatment modalities employed across the centers, with some centers using the combination of amiodarone, cooling, and pacing concurrently, and then the next most common approach being cooling, pacing, and then the application of amiodarone. Nonetheless, the important part of this is that there should be a staged approach to junctional ectopic tachycardia, and it should be ideally consistent across patients. The treatment algorithm that I've employed with a lot of success over my career is documented here, with the discontinuation of vasoactives as a possible, increasing sedation and neuromuscular blockade to decrease catecholamine-mediated driving of the arrhythmia, the early institution of overdrive atrial pacing, followed by active cooling as necessary, and then the application of antiarrhythmic therapy sooner rather than later, while the patient's hemodynamics allow safe utilization of these drugs, being fully aware of the complications that we know of, including hypotension, heart block, and myocardial depression. Restrictive RV physiology is a particularly important postoperative physiologic derangement that has been discussed by multiple prior speakers. In this important work from 1995, this graph shows that in 35 patients following tetralogy of Fallot repair divided into groups with restrictive and non-restrictive physiology, you'll note that the patients with restrictive physiology, as noted in group 1, had lower indices of blood pressure and cardiac output as marked by urine output, pH, and core to peripheral temperature gap. I think this is one of my favorite studies that I've highlight often in tetralogy of Fallot because they used exquisite Doppler measurements by echocardiogram to understand the importance of restrictive physiology. And these investigators demonstrate early diastolic filling of the pulmonary artery as demonstrated on the graphic on the left, indicating the RV is essentially a conduit to the pulmonary artery with very little contractile contribution to pulmonary blood flow. Similarly, in the graphic on the right, you'll notice that the pulmonary artery flow and the tricuspid valve annular flow is markedly reduced with the application of positive pressure. This study begins to highlight why the arrhythmia of jet and AV dysynchrony is such an important hemodynamic factor in postoperative tetralogy patients when some of their pulmonary blood flow is being contributed via atrial systole in likely a disproportionate manner because of the restriction of the RV. In a study that has been mentioned by Parvati and others in prior talks, Shekhar Damian and her colleagues in studying 23 patients with tetralogy of Fallot demonstrated a 22% increase in QP with the application of negative pressure. And in subsequent studies also were able to show that the application of a second round of negative pressure ventilation in fact increased the QP in a greater fashion than a single application, and it was more pronounced in the patients who had restrictive physiology as shown in the dark black bars. Interestingly, in similar work by Bronicky, highlighting what we've now shown to be true, that patients following extubation have an increase in their mean blood pressure and their CVP with restrictive physiology. However, there's no free lunch, and what is also shown nicely in this study is that cerebral oxygen saturation as measured by NIRS increased significantly with extubation. However, mesenteric oxygen saturation, also measured by NIRS, dropped in a significant fashion. The importance of this is that while extubation likely increases cerebral oxygen delivery, demonstrating that the cerebral oxygen extraction might be approaching supply-dependent levels, the cost is to the non-vital organs in the mesentery, and the recognition of the team at the bedside must be that what this is likely a reflection of is the metabolic demand of the respiratory pump and the oxygen consumption of the patient from the work of breathing, which is not insignificant, particularly in the neonate. I'm going to quickly move through these slides. When patients who have severe restrictive physiology can get into a challenging feedback loop, which is marked by ongoing fluid resuscitation, persistent LCOS, and capillary leak. In these patients, early consideration for echocardiogram, ultrasound of the abdomen to look for ascites, and evacuation of such is important, and ultimately only rarely may require opening chest in order to allow for space for the expanding right ventricle, which also becomes edematous. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip this slide and move on to what is an important part of why I'm so privileged to be here today. Not only to be sitting in the room where it happened, so to speak, where history was made, but to be a part of this distinguished group of speakers. As a history major, I do not take lightly what is happening today on the 76th anniversary of these pioneers. Isaac Newton said, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." And we are certainly doing that here today, not just with those in this picture, but with Mr. Edinburgh participating in this call. One of the benefits of being at Johns Hopkins, amongst all of the others, is that we have an amazing history and archive here. And this picture was shown earlier by Dr. Carl. But what I've also been able, with the permission of Mr. Edinburgh, is to access all of Mr. Edinburgh's records. And I'd like to take a minute to show you some of these. This is the op note from Dr. Blaylock describing Mr. Edinburgh's operation. And you see here number 44 in the upper right-hand corner. What Dr. Blaylock describes at the end of this op note is that he's comfortable and happy with the repair because, quote, a good thrill could be felt over the pulmonary artery. So while now we talk about post-operative echocardiograms and the potential need for catheterization, Dr. Blaylock, Dr. Taussig, and Vivian Thomas relied on much simpler things, many of which unfortunately are overlooked today in the midst of our technological milieu that we live in. Also notably, we were able to locate blood gas information from Mr. Edinburgh, and amazing data comes from this. Mr. Edinburgh presented to Johns Hopkins on September 28th of 1945. And what you'll notice here is an arterial oxygen saturation of 29.9%. Following his operation on October 2nd, his saturation rose to 65.7%. Oh, excuse me. And on discharge, Mr. Edinburgh amazingly had a saturation of 71.9%. We talk about postoperative arrhythmias. These are Mr. Edinburgh's ECGs from his time at Johns Hopkins, and this is just a sampling. The image on the left is his preoperative ECG, and you see we have the benefit of 12 leads. Not only is Dr. Taussig hearing impaired, but she certainly was working with a different set of data than we currently have today. This is Mr. Edinburgh's preoperative ECG demonstrating sinus tachycardia, and the graphic on the bottom right, you'll notice on postoperative day 7, his ECG demonstrated that Mr. Edinburgh had a brief episode of paroxysmal atrial tachycardia, which self-resolved. We all now talk a lot in the ICU about the importance of continuous physiologic data streaming and the ability for us to learn a lot about our patients from acquiring real-time monitoring data. This is the real-time monitoring data from 1945. This looks like an anesthesia flow sheet, but in fact was the flow sheet from the bedside of Mr. Edinburgh's stay at Hopkins, in which you'll note is vital sign charting of respirations and pulse with dotted lines here. The admission on the far left of this graphic. Mr. Edinburgh had his operation on October 2nd. On early morning of October 4th, there's notation here of a thoracentesis with 100 cc's of blood fluid from around his lung. This is documented in the chart as here at 3 a.m. and I've highlighted it. Cleanup stat for thoracentesis and pleural injection of penicillin, 100,000 units performed at 3 a.m. You'll notice on admission to the ICU, we talk about early extubation. Mr. Edinburgh was also a pioneer in that. Mr. Edinburgh arrived at 12 p.m. to what was the cardiac intensive care unit at that time, extubated, and you'll note on an oxygen tent, getting Denbutal suppositories for pain, blood pressures every half an hour, and Mr. Edinburgh was allowed tap water ad lib, no bottled Deer Park, nothing, just straight from the well. And amazing work by the team and an amazing strength and resilience by Mr. Edinburgh. All of this has allowed us to arrive where we are today. This is a picture of our opening of our new cardiac intensive care unit here at Johns Hopkins. These photos are shown with permission. This is a family of a baby born at 1.6 kilos, premature with tetralogy of Fallot, who stayed in our ICU on prostaglandin, maintaining ductal patency to allow for growth. He underwent complete repair of tetralogy of Fallot at 2.4 kilos and is nearing discharge from the hospital after an uneventful postoperative course. It is stories like these that put the history into context and allow us to understand the amazing strides that we have made, thanks in part to the medical pioneers, but in no small part to people like you, Mr. Edinburgh, pictured here in a recent visit to Johns Hopkins last year. I can't thank you enough for giving us this opportunity I want to say a quick thank you to the medical archives and marketing team here at Hopkins and to Mr. Edinburgh for giving HIPAA permission to access his records. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Darren. That was fantastic. And I know I'm jumping in because I've been communicating with our next speaker, Dr. Jacobs, because we've gone over. We were scheduled to stop here at 1. Dr. Jacobs has very graciously agreed to put his talk at the beginning of the part 2 session, which will take place in 1 week. And we will send around emails to everyone and put that back up so we can start with results and then move into long-term outcomes. I want to thank everyone who's on the call today and everyone who's in the audience for something I think is historic. We've had people from 10 countries and 5 continents as part of this entire 2-part series, talking about where things have come 76 years and 1 day after the first Blalock-Taussig-Thomas shunt. And I'm really humbled to be a part of it. If you still have an opportunity to use the audience polling system, please do for any comments you'd like to make to us. And I see that people are getting back on the call. Thank you, India. Thank you, Nigeria. Thank you, Canada. Thank you, Brazil. Thank you, Italy. And thank you, Baltimore, as well as Gainesville, Florida, Jeff. It's been a terrific time. Again, we are doing this again, 10 to 1 o'clock Eastern US time, 1 week from today, and we hope to see you then. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Gil. Bye-bye.
Well done. Thanks for sharing all that stuff from Hopkins, Shelby and Darren.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Gil. Thank you, everybody. Great to meet you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Hey, Lorenzo and Elega, I can still see you. Hi, Parvathy. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you. Bye.
It's really terrific. Well, you get rotated in on the faculty. So if you've been through a bunch of these, I think this is your first one, Angelica, but
Yeah.
Lorenzo, you certainly have seen them. If you have ideas for topics or other things you think would be of interest, I think we're probably going to move to shorter webinars in 2021. I think as people are working, it's a bit harder to get 3 hours of time. I think doing more 1 hour type things will be of interest. So if you have ideas, we can do them in Portuguese, we can do them in Italian, we can do them in Spanish and English, of course. So any ideas, obviously, either Sasha or Grace or myself, just reach out, please.
Oh, thank you very much. It was a privilege. Thank you.
Thank you for being part of it.
Thank you.
All right, hopefully we see you next week. Hey, Elio.
Absolutely.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.